Hey guys, tonight we're travelling deep into the creaky wooden bed frames and candlelit absurdity of medieval Europe's wedding night traditions. And I'll be honest with you, you probably won't survive this. Not emotionally anyway. Between the livestock under your bed, a bishop by the door, and your mother-in-law undressing you with a glass of mead in hand, it's safe to say you'll never look at your own wedding photos the same way again. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here, and I want to know, where are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Drop it in the comments. Always fun to see who's doom scrolling their way to sleep with me. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Your wedding night begins with an audience. Not figuratively. There are literal people watching you climb into bed. The public bedding ceremony, popular across much of medieval Europe, was a formal, often mandatory event where the new couple was paraded to the bridal chamber and symbolically tucked into bed, usually by family members, priests and drunk noblemen who'd had a little too much mead. This wasn't a fleeting, awkward moment. It was a full event, complete with toasts, chants and even poetry, if someone had a flair for the dramatic. Now imagine it's your wedding night. You're holding your partner's hand. You're both exhausted from an hours-long feast, and suddenly your parents, your priest, and half the town are trailing behind you with candles, baskets of linens, and, yes, a lute player. You pass under a ceremonial archway, maybe decked out with wildflowers or old fertility symbols, and you enter the bedchamber. Your bed is large, wooden, carved with your family crest. The sheets are fresh, the hearth is lit, and then you're both led to the bed and publicly tucked in like toddlers. For many noble couples, the event even included a ceremonial disrobing, where attendants removed your outer garments while making a few not-so-subtle jokes about what comes next. The crowd might break into song or light chants, something between a wedding march and a frat party. If you were high-ranking, a scribe or priest might even stand in the corner taking notes. Why? Because consummation mattered more than the vows. If you didn't seal the deal, the marriage wasn't legally binding in many parts of Europe, especially among royalty, where inheritance and lineage depended on a very specific kind of performance. And yes, someone was often there to witness it. Sometimes the audience would leave right before the act, offering privacy, which meant standing just outside the door and listening for certain noises. In other regions, the bedding ceremony ended only after an official, often the local lord or bishop, personally confirmed the newlyweds were both in bed and engaged. Sometimes this meant staying in the room for an uncomfortable amount of time, lurking near the curtains or sipping wine in the corner like the world's worst chaperone. This wasn't all just creepy tradition for its own sake. The public bedding had legal implications. It was a kind of living contract that everyone present bore witness to. If there were ever disputes about the legitimacy of the marriage, someone could be called to testify that yes, they did see you both in bed, and no, you did not seem to be fighting or sobbing or escaping through a window. It was also a flex. The bigger and more theatrical the ceremony, the more powerful the couple appeared. In a world where status was everything, what better way to show dominance than by having an entourage deliver you to your bed, chant blessings over your pillows, and then cheerfully confirm that the family line was about to continue? Now here's a fun fringe fact. In some regions of France and Germany, they added an extra layer of ridiculousness. Literal ribbons tied around the bedposts by noblewomen, who sometimes sprinkled rose petals or even gold coins across the mattress for luck. You're standing there, half undressed, and a distant aunt is fastening ribbons to your headboard with a sly grin. It's all just another Tuesday in medieval marital tradition. Not everyone was thrilled about this. Scholars today still debate just how universal or consistent these public bedding ceremonies really were. Some argue that much of what we know comes from church documents and elite households, where theatrics were more common. Among peasants or rural villagers, it might have been a more private affair, though there are still plenty of folk tales describing local elders gathering outside the hut and waiting for sounds of success. There's also ongoing debate about whether this tradition was more about social policing than celebration. After all, keeping a close eye on what happened that night wasn't just about joy, it was about control. Control of women, control of property, control of lineage. If someone could prove consummation didn't happen, a marriage could be annulled, a dowry could be reclaimed, a powerful alliance could fall apart overnight. But in the moment, none of that matters to you. You're lying in bed. The candles are flickering. Your spouse's hand is sweaty in yours. There's still laughter echoing from the hallway. Somewhere outside, a cousin is strumming a lute and making up bawdy rhymes with your name in them. You try not to make eye contact with the bishop who's still loitering awkwardly near the doorframe. The fire crackles. You exhale. And finally, the door creaks shut behind the last witness, and you're alone. Or almost alone. You'll see what I mean in the next section. So you're finally alone, except you're not. That moment you were hoping for, that breath of peace? Not quite. Because just as the door clicks, shut behind the bishop, two women you've never met, possibly your spouse's distant cousins or chambermaids from the estate, are already stepping forward with practiced hands. This is the part where you're undressed. Not by your partner, no romantic candlelit fumbling here. In this phase of the evening, your wedding night strip down is a public ritual, and often handled by other people entirely, specifically by in-laws. Yep, if you're the bride, it's almost always your husband's family doing the honours. Welcome to medieval intimacy, where your new mother-in-law may be untying your girdle while telling you how she hopes you're sturdy enough for childbearing. You stand there, warm from wine and nerves, while a pair of older women peel back layers of linen and wool with swift impersonal efficiency. It's half a ceremony, half a health inspection, and all very, very awkward. The process is methodical. First, they remove your veil or headdress, often placing it on a symbolic hook near the bedpost. Then go the outer garments, your dress, girdle, cloak, each folded and placed carefully in a chest at the foot of the bed. It's considered bad luck to toss the clothes or let them touch the floor. At this point, your linen underdress remains, but only briefly. They might pause to examine your hair, your shoulders, even your hips, sometimes making casual, unsettling comments like, "She has strong hands, she'll be good with dairy," or, "Oh, her collarbones are lucky." If you're the groom, it's less ceremonial, but still uncomfortable. Male friends or attendants might help you undress, occasionally making jokes or gestures that range from supportive to downright grotesque. Sometimes they toss your clothes into the fire as a symbolic gesture of burning the bachelor away. Super charming. But back to you, standing near the bed, shivering not from cold, but from the realization that the wedding night you imagined is wildly different from what's actually happening. When you're finally helped into bed, it's not even just you and your spouse. There might be an entire ritual sequence, depending on your region or class. In certain noble houses, attendants stood by while the couple said a final prayer. In Scandinavian courts, it was customary for the father of the bride to bless the bed, sometimes while holding an ancestral sword. Nothing gets the mood going quite like a father-in-law with a weapon, and here's where it gets quirkier. In many Germanic and Scandinavian regions, the disrobing wasn't just about modesty or tradition, it was about fertility symbolism. The act of others undressing the couple represented communal hopes for a fruitful union. It wasn't supposed to be sensual, it was ceremonial. There are records of villages where the bride's shoes were taken off and tossed over the roof of the house to guarantee sons. One shoe on the roof? A boy? Two shoes? Twins. The logic is fuzzy, but not everyone submitted to this with a smile. One bizarre case from the 14th century France describes a noble bride who refused to let anyone undress her. She locked herself in the bedchamber and forced her new husband to fetch a priest to annul the ceremonial portion of the ritual. The gossip from that one reportedly lasted generations. In some parts of Italy, brides would weep during the disrobing, not out of sadness or fear, but because they were expected to, a sign of virtue and reluctance. basically a performative meltdown for the crowd. Modern historians debate the psychological impact of all this. Was the stripping ceremony empowering, humiliating, or simply another social norm no one questioned? Feminist scholars argue that for many women, especially those marrying into higher status families, this was a moment of complete vulnerability in an unfamiliar house, surrounded by strangers who now technically had control over her body, her wealth, and her future. And yet, some anthropologists point out that women often perform this role for other women, suggesting a weird form of solidarity, a secret club of candlelit side eyes and whispered warnings. One especially fringe account comes from a remote Alpine village, where the bridal undressing included passing the bride's garments through a ring made of iron nails before folding them. Supposedly, this protected the couple from evil spirits or jealous neighbours. The fact that your underwear had to be demon-proof, classic medieval priorities. Then there's the question of clothing as identity. In medieval Europe, your garments told people everything: your social class, your occupation, even your regional identity. When those clothes came off, you symbolically left behind your former life. That was part of the ritual's weight, stripping away your past self, becoming something new, a wife, a husband, a partner in a dynastic contract that just happened to involve a canopy bed and an audience. Eventually, the chambermaids or cousins or oddly cheerful aunties finish their duties. Maybe they give you a pat on the head, or murmur a blessing, or simply bow and slip out into the hallway. You're in bed now, possibly clutching the edge of the sheets like a lifeline, while your new spouse is on the opposite side, equally stunned, equally silent. The fire has burned down low. The lute music outside has faded into hoarse, drunken laughter. Somewhere down the corridor a goat bleats. Probably not symbolically, just a goat, or maybe not. But there's no time to ponder livestock metaphors just yet, because before you can even process what just happened, the door opens again. The door creaks open again. You and your spouse freeze, wide-eyed under the covers, already stripped bare by tradition and nerves. Surely it's over. Surely no more people are coming in. But no, because this is medieval Europe, and privacy is still a few centuries away from being invented. In walks a witness, sometimes two, and they're here for one reason: to confirm that the marriage has in fact been consummated. If your soul just shriveled a bit, congratulations, you're officially human. The idea behind having witnesses wasn't just ceremonial. In many medieval regions, especially among nobility and landowning classes, a marriage wasn't legally or spiritually binding until it was physically confirmed. That meant there needed to be someone, usually a family member, priest, or court-appointed observer, who could verify that the act had taken place. Not necessarily by watching the entire thing, although in a few rare and truly horrifying cases, yes, it came close, but by being close enough to hear, see, or later examine evidence. More on that soon, unfortunately. If you were part of a royal or aristocratic household, this role could fall to your most loyal servant, a trusted advisor, or, bizarrely often, your mother-in-law. They would be tasked with staying just outside the room, listening closely for clues, groaning, giggling, a faint, rhythmic creak of the mattress, the blessed sound of performance. In some cases, they'd enter immediately afterward to inspect the sheets, to ask deeply inappropriate questions, or to offer congratulations that no one asked for. It wasn't unheard of for the witness to remain in the room the entire time, sometimes sitting in a corner with a candle, facing the wall, humming softly as if that made it less weird. Imagine trying to concentrate under those circumstances. You and your spouse exchange a glance, a silent scream passing between your eyes. No pressure or anything, just your new father-in-law over there pretending to examine the drapes while holding a notepad. In England, especially during the Tudor period, this practice became institutionalised. Royal bedding witnesses were considered part of the legal apparatus. There are recorded instances of Parliament getting involved if no one could testify to the consummation. The stakes were that high. Children born to an unconsummated marriage could be considered illegitimate. Lands and titles could revert to the crown. Entire wars were fought because someone forgot or refused to invite a witness to their wedding night. It wasn't always this extreme. Among common folk, especially in rural areas, the ritual was often more theatrical than invasive. A midwife or elder might bless the room and then leave a symbolic object behind, a fertility token, a jug of milk or a chunk of bread. In one particularly eccentric Welsh tradition, witnesses would leave behind a live chicken in the room. If the chicken laid an egg during the night, it was a sign of future children. If it did something less productive, well, the symbolism got fuzzy. But even among peasants, someone was usually nearby. Neighbours or family would often crowd just outside the house, sometimes singing bawdy songs or banging pots and pans to encourage the couple. It's like a musical pressure cooker. If nothing was, heard by dawn, speculation would swirl. People would whisper, women would exchange glances at the village well. Suddenly, the bride's value or the groom's manliness was under scrutiny. For the couple themselves, it was like trying to share a first kiss in the middle of a town square, except that instead of a kiss, it's a legally binding reproductive act, and instead of cheers, the soundtrack is a group of your cousins mimicking barnyard animals outside the window. A famous example of this ceremony going off the rails comes from France in the 15th century, when a nobleman named Gilles de Rais, yes, that Gilles, staged a bedding ceremony that ended in complete farce. Dozens of guests barged into the room mid-act, spilled wine on the bed, and demanded a second round for the sake of confirmation. Gilles complied, his bride fainted. The marriage was eventually annulled for unrelated reasons, thankfully. Here's a fringe fact. In some Slavic territories, the bedding witnesses didn't just confirm the consummation, they delivered a live commentary to the rest of the wedding party. One would run out of the chamber shouting coded messages like "the horse has mounted the mare" or "the seed has been sown," and the crowd would erupt in cheers like it was the final goal in the medieval World Cup. Accuracy of these reports? Questionable. Embarrassment level? Nuclear. Of course, modern scholars argue over how widespread these customs actually were. Some say the witness in the room idea is more myth than fact, a bit of scandalous storytelling from later centuries misrepresenting what was mostly symbolic. Others insist the records are clear. These witnesses were real, and they were there. What's unclear is how strictly their presence was enforced, and whether every couple went through with it as expected. Some couples, especially in higher-ranking families, arranged substitutes, stand-ins who would fake the signs of consummation, or simply swear it happened without actually checking. In other words, medieval ghosting, but for sex verification. And in very rare cases, couples refused the entire ritual, resulting in annulments, scandals, or even exile, depending on how powerful the family was. So here you are, lying in bed with your new spouse, while someone, not so subtly, shuffles around outside the door, maybe holding a candle, maybe just listening with their ear pressed to the oak wood. The bed creaks under even the slightest movement. The air feels heavy, not just with candle smoke, but with expectation. You can't relax, can't breathe, can't blink without wondering if someone's jotting it down for the family record. You shift under the covers, trying to ignore the sound of your name being rhymed with virility outside the window. Your partner takes your hand. You both let out nervous laughs that dissolve into silence. Welcome to the most important night of your life, brought to you by surveillance and folklore. Just when you think this wedding night can't get any stranger, someone knocks on the chamber door again, a soft rap, polite but persistent. Then the handle turns and in walks a man holding... Is that a bone? No, wait, it's a relic, a saint's femur or maybe a scrap of tunic in a glass vial, depending on how rich or religious your family is. Because of course, how could anyone hope to consummate a proper medieval marriage without a few sacred objects blessed by the church and questionably authenticated? The blessing of the bridal bed was a widespread custom, especially in Christian households, and it brought a peculiar collision of holy reverence and awkward anticipation. a priest or family elder would walk in with a selection of relics, perhaps a sliver of the true cross, a vial of oil, or a scrap of some obscure martyr's undergarment, and begin chanting prayers over the bed. The language was often Latin, but the mood was very local, half reverent, half, let's get this over with. You and your new spouse sit awkwardly beneath the covers, trying not to fidget while the priest mumbles something about sanctity, fruitfulness, and avoiding the snares of Satan. Occasionally he sprinkles holy water on the sheets, hopefully not directly on your face, but accidents happen. The mattress smells like rosemary and damp wool. The relic, now placed gently on a wooden stool near the headboard, stares at you like a third guest. Some saints were said to bless the fertility of the couple if their relics were present. Others were known to guard against sin, which really adds a certain pressure to the moment. In wealthier households, this part of the night could be a minor production. Candles would be lit in specific numbers, 3 for the Trinity, 7 for divine completeness, and a procession of priests, monks, or pious aunties might file through, offering blessings and reciting psalms. In certain Italian courts, it was fashionable to have a carved statue of St. Anne or Mary placed at the foot of the bed, offering what can only be described as holy supervision. In France, there was a tradition where the family's wedding relic was passed down from generation to generation. Sometimes it was a chunk of saintly bone, other times a nail from an old cathedral. One unfortunate account describes a couple being blessed by a relic of Saint Fiacre, who was known primarily as the patron saint of hemorrhoids. You win some, you lose some. These relics weren't just religious symbols, they were believed to offer spiritual protection. Marriage wasn't just a social contract, it was a battlefield. The devil, after all, was said to hate marriage. A happy, fruitful union was a threat to sin itself, and so, as you sat there under the itchy wool blanket, you were also participating in spiritual warfare. The priest would remind you to love each other in Christ, to honour the sanctity of your roles, and to definitely not forget the importance of procreation. You know, just in case that wasn't already clear from the 30 people who helped you undress. In Germany, there were versions of this ritual where the couple had to sleep with a small crucifix on the pillow between them. Not to prevent anything physical from happening, but to remind them that God was the third member of their union. Comforting, right? In more rural areas, especially in early Slavic Christian communities, they took this a step further by placing relics under the bed itself. You might find yourself sharing your mattress with a chipped piece of altar stone or a locket full of saintly ashes. If the bed frame creaked during the night, was it you, or divine disapproval? Not every blessing was Christian, though. Older pagan customs often bled into these rituals, especially in places like Ireland and Scandinavia. You might have a local priest bless the bed one minute, and then a wise woman sneak in to place a protective charm beneath the sheets the next. A saint's relic on the nightstand, and a woven knot of herbs tied beneath the bed slats. Double coverage just in case. And then there's the matter of swords. Yes, swords. In some noble households, the groom's family would place a ceremonial sword across the bed or between the couple. This sword wasn't a weapon, it was a symbol of honour, of protection, of lineage. But also, in some interpretations, it represented the groom's, capabilities. Let's just say Freud would have had a field day. The sword might be passed down for generations, blessed by a bishop, and polished to a high shine before being laid down on the marital mattress like a glittering third wheel. One rather surreal anecdote comes from a 12th century court in Hungary, where the groom's ancestral sword was accidentally laid on the wrong side the bed, leading to a panic about future misfortunes. The wedding was postponed, the bed was re-blessed, and the couple had to recite an additional set of prayers to counteract the sword's accidental symbolism. Imagine delaying your honeymoon because your heirloom blade was pointing east instead of west. Modern scholars often debate the role of these relics and rituals. Some argue they were spiritual theatre, visible signs of devotion more than actual belief in divine intervention. Others claim they served a vital psychological purpose, offering comfort and structure to what was, for many, a terrifying and deeply unfamiliar night. After all, most couples had never met before the wedding. Tossing a saint into the mix might have actually helped, but there's another theory, that these rituals weren't for the couple at all. They were for the family, for the crowd, for everyone else who needed to believe that this union was sanctioned, sacred and protected. The relic on the stool, a silent reminder to behave. The sword on the bed, a placeholder for legacy. The whole thing, a performance. So now the priest has finally packed up his relics, offered one last solemn nod and stepped out the door. You're left alone again, sort of. The saint's femur is still glowing faintly on its pedestal. The sword gleams under the firelight. The bed smells like incense and nerves, and now, just when things couldn't feel more complicated, you hear a soft rustling beneath the bed. Don't worry, it's not what you think. It's just the village goat, or possibly a fertility totem crawling back to life. You freeze. There's that soft rustling again, something shifting beneath the bed. You lift the edge of the heavy linen sheet, already mentally preparing to come face to face with a disoriented rat or a particularly determined servant. But no, it's something stranger. Tucked just beneath the carved oak bed frame is a tiny bundle. Dried herbs, a chicken feather, a cracked doll's head made of clay, and yes, a small leather pouch that smells unmistakably like goat. Welcome to medieval fertility superstition. Tonight you are not only participating in the sanctity of holy matrimony, you are a living vessel in the great metaphysical relay race of reproduction, and apparently you need all the magical backup you can get. The belief that certain animals, or objects related to animals, could promote fertility wasn't fringe. In fact, in some corners of medieval Europe, it was practically scientific. Got a goat hoof tucked under the mattress? That's not weird. That's preparation. Many families, particularly those from farming communities or smaller villages, relied on deeply entrenched folk practices to ensure the wedding night was, let's say, productive. You sit up peering under the bed, your eyes adjusting to the flickering firelight. There's a wicker basket filled with oddities, bundles of fennel and rosemary, strips of fur, a lump of salt, and what might be an eyeball, hopefully from an animal. Some of these items have been lovingly placed by your relatives. Others may have been slipped in secretly by a well-meaning aunt, midwife, or hedge witch. The more layered your family's background, the richer the stew of beliefs. Let's break down this odd little underbed collection. The herbs are common: rosemary for memory and fidelity, fennel to ward off evil spirits, rue for passion, and wormwood for, well, worming, just in case. The chicken feather might symbolise new life. The cracked clay doll's head? That's likely a charm passed down to draw the child, a superstition rooted in ancient pagan practices where figurines were believed to house fertility spirits. And the goat stuff? That's peak medieval fertility magic. Goats were associated with virility, thanks to their tireless enthusiasm for mating, and their, let's say, confidence in public. Placing goat hair or even dried goat dung under the bed was thought to inspire a similarly fruitful outcome in humans. Romantic, no? In some parts of Eastern Europe, couples were even encouraged to place a live animal under the bed, a rabbit, a chicken, or yes, a goat, so that the creature's life force would encourage the couple to begin making more life. One Hungarian folk tale recounts a bride waking up to find her husband asleep and a goat licking his feet. That marriage reportedly yielded 6 children. But not all of these rituals were hopeful. Some were protective. People feared more than infertility. They feared curses, barren wombs, impotence, and most terrifying of all, spirits that could enter the bedchamber during the act and snatch away the potential for life. To protect against these spectral threats, people would place iron nails in the walls, hang dried garlic near the hearth, or bury protective runes beneath the floorboards. It's not just a wedding night, it's a fortress, and it's not just the bed. Some traditions required the bride to step over a particular animal before entering the bedchamber. In parts of rural England, the favourite was a cat. In northern Germany, a piglet. In the Balkans, couples had to walk around a burning log while carrying a rooster. All of it designed to anchor fertility into the ritual and into the marriage. You're not just a couple. You're now officially walking mascots for agricultural symbolism. Now here's a weird fringe fact for you. In parts of Brittany, it was customary to place a dead mole in the bedchamber on the wedding night. Not as a warning, but as a blessing. The mole was believed to tunnel into the earth as a symbol of deep-rooted fertility. Couples would place it under the bed or bury it nearby, trusting that its earthy vibes would help plant the metaphorical seed. If you're wondering how it smelled, probably not great. Of course, not all families went to these extremes. Some took a simpler route, putting a single apple under the pillow or placing a small wooden spindle at the foot of the bed to invoke the fates. But regardless of the specifics, the intention was clear: make a baby and make one soon. Medieval marriages weren't judged by love or mutual respect. They were judged by heirs, fields, and legacies. There's still debate among historians about how seriously these fertility traditions were taken. Some argue they were more symbolic than practical. Ritual theatre meant to reassure nervous newlyweds and nosy relatives. Others point out that the incredible variety and persistence of these customs across regions and centuries suggest that people did believe deeply in their power. Even today, in some rural areas of Europe, remnants of these practices remain. Not the goat dung, hopefully, but the herbs, the charms, the whispered blessings. What's more intriguing is that these rituals weren't always gendered. While the bride was often the focus, scrutinised for her childbearing potential, the groom wasn't let off the hook. Some families would secretly evaluate the groom's vital signs before the ceremony. There were even herbal potions prepared specifically for men, designed to awaken the dragon, as one 15th century recipe book charmingly phrased it. Dragon awakening tonic included garlic, nettle, raw egg, and the ashes of a rooster's spur. Drink up, Casanova. Back in your chamber, you finally pull the sheet over your head, trying to block out the smell of herbs, relics, and faint goat musk. Somewhere in the room, something jingles faintly. Probably a protective bell left by the midwife. Your partner sighs beside you, maybe still wide-eyed from the sword, the saint's femur, and now this herbal episode. You lie still, listening to the quiet crackle of the fire, the muffled party downstairs, and of course, the occasional goat sneeze from under the bed. A fertility charm, they said. A blessing. You try to believe them. The fire in the hearth has quieted down to a few glowing embers, casting a soft amber glow across the bedchamber. You're just starting to settle, trying to forget the goat noises and the tiny graveyard of fertility trinkets beneath the mattress, when there's a sudden knock on the chamber door. Not a gentle tap this time, a confident, purposeful knock. Then the door creaks open and your stomach drops. It's your new mother-in-law, flanked by a pair of older women with folded linen in their arms and serious expressions on their faces. You're about to meet the deflowering cloth. With solemn ceremony, one of the women approaches the foot of the bed and lays down a pure white sheet, smooth and carefully folded. This is no ordinary linen, this one is for proof. The deflowering cloth, also known in some regions as the virginity sheet or chambra linen, is here to serve one purpose: collect physical evidence that the bride was a virgin and that the marriage has been consummated, that evidence, of course, being blood. You glance at your spouse glances at you. No words are exchanged, but the mutual horror is palpable. The mother-in-law gives a tight-lipped smile, approving, expectant, and a little bit smug. Then they all leave again, the door shutting with an almost ceremonial click. It's easy to think this might have been a rare or symbolic practice, but no, it was real, and in some places absolutely required. In many medieval cultures, particularly among the nobility and merchant classes, virginity was treated like a contract. something tangible that could be confirmed, documented, and held up as social and legal proof of the bride's worth. If blood appeared on the sheet, everything was good. If not, well, the consequences range from social shaming to annulment to outright banishment. The cloth was often white, occasionally embroidered, and sometimes branded with the family crest, because even evidence of consummation could be a status symbol. After the wedding night, it might be displayed briefly to a small group of women in the household, like a reverse victory flag. And yes, there were entire chambers in some castles where such cloths were stored, like a strange trophy room of marital achievements. Of course, let's just say the biology here is a bit optimistic. Anyone who's taken a basic anatomy course knows that not all women bleed the first time, and even in the Middle Ages people sort of knew that too, but facts often took a backseat to expectations, especially when money, land and lineage were on the line. Families didn't just hope for blood, they demanded it, and in some cases they had backup plans in case the natural method failed to produce the desired result. Which brings us to the trickery. Some brides, anticipating the scrutiny, would prick their fingers before or after the act, dabbing the sheet just enough to pass inspection. Others might sneak in a bit of animal blood, usually from a chicken, since they were handy and symbolic of fertility anyway. Midwives sometimes coached brides through this deception, fully aware that not every wedding night went according to biology or consent. In one infamous case from 14th century Spain, a noble bride used blood from a freshly killed pigeon hidden beneath the bed. Her new husband never noticed, and the family celebrated the successful proof with a small feast. It was considered such a clever solution that her cousins copied the idea in their own weddings. The pigeons were probably less enthusiastic. Then there's the darker side. If the sheet came back unstained, the bride could be accused of impurity, even if she had never been touched. A lack of blood didn't just mean suspicion, it could mean scandal, annulment, or in rare cases, actual punishment. One German legal document from the 15th century outlines a case in which a bride's dowry was revoked due to an unsatisfactory bedding sheet. She appealed, claiming faulty linen. The court disagreed. Still, the pressure wasn't always directed only at the bride. If the cloth showed no sign of use at all, no blood, no creases, no action marks, then the groom could be accused of impotence. Suddenly, it wasn't just her virginity under scrutiny, but his masculinity. There are records of men being examined by church officials or even local physicians to determine if they were physically capable of consummation. This could include everything from invasive exams to drinking bizarre aphrodisiac tonics made from ox bile and wine. Romantic, right? Speaking of aphrodisiacs, here's a fringe fact. In some regions of Poland, brides were fed a mixture of honey and rabbit brain on their wedding day to increase the chances of producing a male heir. Whether it worked is a mystery. Whether it was disgusting is not. As for the cloth itself, in some regions it became a family artifact. The most successful deflowering sheets were passed down like heirlooms, stored in cedar chests and used in future weddings, sometimes by multiple generations. In extreme cases, families embroidered the date of consummation in one corner of the cloth, alongside a blessing or a line from scripture. Think of it as a weird bodily guest book. Historians still debate how widespread and formalised this practice truly was. Some argue that while bloodied sheets were certainly a part of tradition, the ritualised public display was likely exaggerated by later writers. Others believe the practice was far more common than we think, just quietly hushed up in historical records because, well, you. But whether literal or symbolic, the cloth carried massive social weight. A stained sheet meant peace, an unstained one meant questions, explanations, and possibly consequences that reached far beyond the bedroom. For women especially, it was a nightly test with no do-over. So now you lie there, staring at that stark white linen like it's a final exam. The firelight flickers, your spouse exhales slowly, you both know what's expected, and you also know there's a chicken feather under the bed and a goat watching you with judgmental eyes. No pressure. Just when you thought the ritual parade was finally over, the sounds begin. Muffled at first, like a drunken tavern chorus drifting through a courtyard, then clearer, louder, and unmistakably aimed at you. Somewhere outside your chamber window a crowd is gathering. You hear boots on cobblestones, the clatter of tankards, and voices belting out melodies that sound vaguely like wedding songs. If wedding songs were written by half-sober jesters with no filter. Congratulations, you've just entered the next phase of your medieval wedding night, the Charivari, also known as the bedding serenade, or, less poetically, the loudest pressure campaign in marital history. You peek out the window, still barely clothed, and spot a mass of villagers, extended family and party guests assembled below. Some are waving torches, others are holding what look like actual kitchen pans and banging them together with wooden spoons. A few have instruments, flutes, viols, even an old drum, and all of them, are chanting your names and making deeply personal suggestions about what you should be doing right now. This strange tradition wasn't reserved for royalty. From the Scottish Highlands to southern Italy, communities used music, noise, and bawdy cheer to celebrate the couple's wedding night and encouraged them enthusiastically to consummate their union. Whether you were a duke or a dairymaid, chances were good that your wedding night came with a soundtrack, and not the romantic kind. In France, this ritual was called the Charivari, a word that literally means discordant noise. In some English villages they called it chivalry or rough music, and boy did they mean it. It usually started after the final course of the wedding feast, when guests thoroughly pickled in ale and wine took their party to the courtyard or the street below the bride's chamber. They'd gather, light torches, and begin their performance. Crude songs, improvised chants, and loud demands, for the couple to get on with it. The lyrics, let's just say they wouldn't pass FCC regulations. Some were playful. Get the under, don't let her blunder. Others were more visual. In rural Italy, serenaders sometimes shouted, Fai l'amore o torna da tua madre, make love or go back to your mother. While in the German countryside, verses often rhymed the bride's name with agricultural metaphors best left untranslated. It wasn't just about cheering. The crowd had expectations. They might demand proof. No, really. In some towns, the serenaders wouldn't stop until a designated cloth, slipper or bouquet was tossed from the window, symbolizing success. In rarer and extremely awkward cases, they might wait for the couple to appear at the window in their nightclothes and give a cheeky wave, confirming that all was proceeding productively. Talk about performance anxiety. You try pulling the curtain closed, but that only makes them louder. Someone has started a drum solo that's more war march than wedding ballad. A kid yells your name and starts a chant. The smell of roasted meat and sweat wafts through the window, and somewhere from behind a hay cart you hear a cousin yell, "Show us the belt!" You don't know what that means, and you do not want to find out. Here's where things get even weirder. In certain parts of France and the Low Countries, the Charivari became a way to punish or shame couples who didn't fit social expectations. If a widow remarried too soon, if there was a big age gap, or if the bride had a history. Instead of good-natured noise, the serenade turned mocking. Effigies were burned, obscene songs were sung, the couple might be kept awake for hours as the crowd made its judgment known. But tonight, your crowd seems more celebratory than hostile, though that might change if you don't play along. Some traditions required the groom to throw out coins, bread, or apples to appease the crowd. Others expected a speech. Or, in one wild Welsh custom, the groom had to pour a bucket of ale out the window as an offering. If the crowd caught the bucket, they'd cheer. If he missed, they'd bang the pans louder. You can guess which outcome is more restful. A fringe detail. In parts of the Netherlands, the guests would toss beans or peas at the couple's door until they heard movement. Sometimes raw, sometimes boiled. No one really agrees why. Historians theorized the legumes symbolized fertility, or they just hurt less than rocks. You lie back in bed, covering your head with the pillow. It does nothing. The lute player outside has started a ballad about your heroic sword and her valley of plenty, which even in metaphor is a bit much. Your spouse gives you a look like, do we just fake it? And for a second you consider throwing a chicken feather out the window and calling it a night. Modern scholars have tried to unpack the psychology of the Charivari. Some think it was a way for the community to reclaim a sense of involvement in the deeply private parts of marriage. Others see it as a public performance of collective fertility. By celebrating your union loudly and shamelessly, the whole town symbolically invested in your reproductive success. Still others believe it was just an excuse to keep drinking and yelling past curfew. Interestingly, some clergy condemned the practice. In certain church records from the 13th century, bishops wrote scathing complaints about these serenades, calling them disruptions of sacred union and vulgar temptations. Yet in practice, most priests turned a blind eye, or worse, joined in. Eventually the crowd grows tired, or drunk, or both. The banging slows, the chants taper off. A final off-key round of God Bless the Bridegroom trickles through the air. Someone drops their drum, someone else throws up near the livestock pen. One by one the torches go out. You sit up, eyes wide, heart racing, ears ringing from the cacophony. The night is finally quiet, just the soft sound of crickets, a crackle from the hearth, a goat sneeze, again. Your spouse is beside you, still half in shock. You did it. You survived the serenade. Probably, unless they come back in the morning, some do. Just as your eyelids begin to flutter closed, lulled by the blessed silence following the night's rowdy serenade, you're jolted awake by a sharp knock at the door. Not again. You sit up, groggy and disoriented, and before you can even groan in protest, the door creaks open. This time, no priests, no chanting, no torches. Just two servants with a small table, a covered dish, and what looks suspiciously like a jug of wine. Because nothing says romantic afterglow quite like being summoned straight from your marriage bed for the post-coital feast. Yes, in medieval Europe, you don't simply fall asleep and cuddle after your first legally recognised romp. You rise, robe up, and eat. One of the servants draws back the linen cloth on the tray, revealing slices of roast pork, fresh cheese, dense dark bread, and a sticky, glistening fig tart. Your stomach rumbles in betrayal. Honestly, you could eat. You want to eat. But it's also 2 a.m. You just survived a public bedding, a goat-based fertility ritual, a relic blessing, a serenade from drunk cousins, and now you're expected to hold polite conversation and daintily pick at charcuterie. Absolutely. Welcome to marriage. This post-bedding meal was known by different names depending on region. In France, it was called the repas de noces tardif, the late wedding meal. In England, it might be referred to as the morning meat, or simply second supper. It was a chance for the couple to emerge from the chamber or not. Sometimes it was served directly in bed, and show their guests, servants or family members that all had gone as planned. In high-status households, a steward or senior family member might even be invited to dine with the couple, as in, at the foot of the bed. No, you cannot make this stuff up. The menu, as it turns out, was rarely random. Medieval minds believed strongly in the relationship between food, mood, and bodily function. Certain dishes were thought to replenish strength after the act. Others were believed to enhance fertility, restore vital humours, or soothe the womb, for the bride naturally. Eggs, honey, soft cheeses, figs, almonds, and various meats, especially pork and game, were common selections. If your family could afford it, you might also have a saffron-infused custard, which was thought to promote male potency and golden children. Gold being the standard for everything back then, even babies. Your tray features a wedge of sharp sheep's cheese, which smells like a damp monastery, and a warm cup of mead with floating herbs, likely mugwort and fennel. You sip carefully, not entirely sure if this is meant to make you fertile or knock you out cold. Across from you, your spouse is poking suspiciously at a boiled egg dusted in what might be cinnamon. There is no explanation. There never is. Sometimes the feast served a social purpose too. Especially in noble circles, this was a chance for a few close friends or trusted family members to stop by the room, again, perhaps with their own goblets in hand, to raise a toast and ask gentle, deeply inappropriate questions like, "So, everything as it should be?" Or, "Do you feel transformed?" The correct answer was always yes, even if the only thing you feel is emotionally waterboarded by tradition. Now, here's where things get properly unhinged. In certain parts of France and Italy, the newlyweds were expected to perform part of this post-coital meal naked. That's right. The idea was that eating in the nude, with your spouse, directly after the act, preserved the sacred and vulnerable energy of the moment. Think of it as a proto-ritual of bonding, or if you prefer a nightmare dinner theatre. The more pious families might let you wear a linen shift. The more rustic ones, birthday suits only. Some accounts even describe guests walking in with offerings, roasted quail, honeyed almonds, a jug of fortified wine, and gently setting the items near the bed like votive gifts at a shrine. They'd then back away, murmuring blessings under their breath. It's unclear whether they were praying for your happiness or your endurance. A fringe fact for you, in medieval Serbia, there was a specific cake known as the Neveštinsky kolach, the bride's loaf, baked with symbolic shapes of fertility, including snakes, vines, and spiral patterns. After the wedding night, the couple was expected to break the loaf together and share it, feeding each other small pieces. If the bread broke unevenly, superstition claimed the one with the larger piece would be the more dominant partner. Basically a proto-gender reveal party, but for power dynamics. You finish your meal, slowly, chewing the sticky fig tart with a mixture of delight and disbelief. Outside the window, the last of the charivari participants have finally slumped into sleep. Inside, the chamber smells of wax, wine, and roast meat. You glance at the relic on the table. It hasn't moved, but you still don't trust it. The fertility bundle under the bed is silent now, perhaps satisfied. Modern historians argue about the meaning of this meal. Some think it served a critical role in reaffirming the couple's bond, not just physically, but socially. Eating together after the act symbolized harmony, partnership, and transition. You've left behind your separate lives. You've made your vows. Now you break bread together, not as strangers, but as one unit. Others argue the feast was just another social obligation dressed up in spiritual metaphor, a polite way for families to say, "Good job, now come out, here, and show us you're not dead." Either way, the tradition endured for centuries in various forms, in households rich and poor alike. Even today, echoes of it remain in cultures that offer newlyweds special food, sweets, or ceremonial breakfast the morning after. The post-coital cheese board, it seems, is eternal. You stretch, finally full and slightly dizzy from the spiced wine. The servants collect the tray, nodding politely as they disappear once more. The fire has burned down to glowing coals. The relic's glass glints faintly. The goat has mercifully stopped sneezing. And for the first time all day, you and your new spouse are truly alone. You sigh, close your eyes, and just start to drift into a long-awaited sheet-stained slumber. And then someone knocks on the door. Again. You don't even respond to the knock this time. You just lie there, eyes closed, praying that whoever it is will give up and go away. Maybe the door will jam. Maybe the goat will finally earn its keep and headbutt the next visitor. But the hinges creak as the door swings open anyway, and the click of deliberate, confident footsteps begins. You open one eye, and there he is, again, the bishop. You'd almost forgotten he was even invited. He stands at the threshold in full ecclesiastical garb, robes heavy with gold thread, a jewelled cross hanging dramatically over his chest, and a look on his face that says, yes, this is completely normal. Because in certain regions of medieval Europe, it absolutely was. The bishop, or sometimes the local parish priest, had a very particular role on a couple's wedding night, not just blessing the union beforehand, but occasionally showing up after the fact to ensure that God had indeed been glorified. This was less about voyeurism, though try telling that to your frayed nerves, and more about spiritual oversight. In the church's eyes, consummation wasn't just a private act, it was a sacrament, a holy duty bound by divine law. And who better to shepherd that moment than someone who'd taken a vow of celibacy and had nothing else to do at midnight on a Tuesday? He's not here to lecture, though, not tonight. Instead, he glides into the room holding a small book, likely a breviary or a psalter, and a scroll tied with red ribbon. The scroll, he tells you in that slow, grave voice, only bishops and executioners ever seem to master, contains the official declaration of union. In some regions, it was required for this document to be witnessed, signed and sealed not just after the wedding ceremony, but after the bedding. Only then could your marriage be recorded in the church's ledger as complete. You sit up, adjusting the sheet in a vague attempt at dignity. Your spouse does the same, hair tousled and eyes wide with the dazed look of someone still digesting roast pork and existential dread. The bishop unrolls the scroll, eyes scanning the page. Then, calmly, he begins to read. A formal statement that your bodies have united as one flesh, that your souls are bound before God, that this union is now sacred, indissoluble, and eternally fruitful. You try not to choke on your own awkwardness. In noble households, this moment could be surprisingly public. The bishop might stand in the hallway outside the bedchamber, reading the declaration aloud so that waiting guests could hear. A scribe might take notes, consummatum est, scribbled in looping Latin script next to the date and your full names. In royal weddings, the event might even be illustrated later in miniature paintings for court records. Yes, painted, as in, there are actual medieval manuscripts showing couples in bed, smiling awkwardly while someone in a mitre reads out legal text in the background. But even among the peasantry, the bishop's authority carried weight. In some rural towns, the priest would visit each newlywed home in the village during feast days, checking up on couples to ensure Christian harmony was being maintained. It wasn't uncommon for him to offer unsolicited advice about frequency, positions, or even timing. Tuesday nights were popular for procreation, Fridays were discouraged. Sunday mornings, highly controversial. Here's your quirky fringe fact. In parts of medieval Bohemia, the local bishop would sprinkle the marriage bed with blessed salt before the ceremony, then return the next morning to sniff the sheets. You read that correctly. Sniff the sheets. The logic being that salt could purify both sin and linen, and if he detected disruption, the marriage might be considered invalid. It's unclear what exactly he was smelling for, but the records suggest that this man had an opinion. Naturally, there's a scholarly debate about how widespread these customs were. Some argue that bishops only got this involved in high-profile unions, royalty, nobility, or the clergy themselves. Others believe that in deeply religious communities, these rituals filtered down through the entire social fabric. The church, after all, had an interest in regulating marriage, not just spiritually but financially. Consummated marriages meant inheritance, tithe obligations, and often land transfers. If someone had to witness that transaction in the flesh, literally, then so be it. You sign the scroll with a shaky hand, the quill scratchy against the parchment. Your spouse does the same. The bishop nods gravely, then produces a wax seal. He presses it down with a ringed thumb, creating the final official mark of your union. Somewhere in a vault below the church, this scroll will be stored for decades, maybe centuries, sandwiched between records of other marriages, deaths, and property disputes. You're part of history now, and you didn't even get to sleep yet. As he turns to go, the bishop pauses near the relic on the table, the same one he blessed hours earlier. He nods once, mutters something in Latin, and makes the sign of the cross over your bed. You think it's a blessing, but the way he mutters it under his breath, it could just as easily be an apology. He exits, robes whispering across the stone floor, and closes the door with a finality that almost feels like an ending. The fire's nearly out now, casting long shadows that flicker across the ceiling. The food's been cleared. The relic is silent. The goat has finally, curled up and gone to sleep beneath the bed. You lie back. No more clergy, no more chants, just you and your spouse in a bed full of linen that's been blessed, bled on, and possibly judged by 4 different tiers of society. And just as you begin to doze off, your stomach growls again. Don't worry. There's probably another feast coming. You awaken, or maybe you never quite slept, to a soft flicker of movement on the wall. The fire's burned low again, glowing just enough to cast shadows in long, twisting shapes across the carved beams of the ceiling. But the shape moving across the room isn't flickering. It's deliberate, fluid. You sit up slowly, the sheet still tucked around you like armour, and watch as your spouse reaches for something beside the bed. No, not clothes, a sword. This isn't some sleepwalking weapon fetish scenario. This is tradition. In certain regions of medieval Europe, particularly in noble households, the marriage bed was often shared not just by the newlyweds, but by a sword. A long gleaming blade laid down carefully between the couple on the first night. Symbolic? Oh, absolutely, but also a little ominous. In medieval symbolism, the sword represented a host of things: honour, protection, lineage, and, yes, masculinity in all its unsubtle glory. To place a sword in bed on the wedding night was to make a declaration. In some traditions, it meant the groom was dedicating his strength and future to his bride. In others, the sword acted as a sacred stand-in for his virility, left there as a kind of spiritual offering while the couple, rather unironically, lay chastely beside it. In some households, the groom might even sleep with his hand resting on the hilt. You watch as your spouse reverently places the sword between you both, the polished blade catching the last light from the hearth. It glints briefly, then settles like a silent third party in your marriage. Cold, sharp, present, romantic, right? In certain Germanic and Scandinavian cultures, this sword ceremony was deeply ritualized. Some grooms would place a family blade, something passed down from fathers and grandfathers, onto the bed before even entering it themselves. Others would stab the sword into the ground beside the bed or into a wooden stand, calling upon the ancestors to bear witness. If the sword leaned in a certain direction, say, toward the bride, it was taken as an omen of fertility or favour. If it wobbled and fell, well, that was less promising. And then there were the more performative versions. In 13th century Hungary, a knight was expected to perform a ritualistic sword dance before approaching the bed. The bride watched from the bed as her husband twirled, struck poses, and showed off his weapon-handling skills. Only once he'd completed the display to the satisfaction of watching elders could he remove his armour and climb beneath the sheets. You're tired? Too bad. You're still expected to waltz with cold steel before any cuddling, but not all interpretations were so celebratory. In some medieval legal texts, the sword between the couple served a very different purpose: proof of restraint, especially in cases where the bride was extremely young. Yes, sometimes too young to consummate the marriage legally. The sword acted as a visible vow of abstinence. It said, "Not tonight." Sometimes not for years. It wasn't always a literal sword either. In some regions of France and the Iberian Peninsula, the groom might place a dagger or even a decorative cross between himself and his bride on the first night. Something sharp, symbolic, and sanctified. A physical barrier of morality, or at least dramatic intention. A fringe case in the records tells of a nobleman in Bohemia who refused to remove his wedding sword from his belt at any point during the ceremony, the feast, or even while getting into bed. He claimed it was both a family obligation and a personal vow. His bride, reportedly unimpressed, retaliated by bringing a small hunting spear into bed herself. The marriage lasted 4 months. Modern scholars argue about the origin and true meaning of the sword tradition. Some see it as a vestige of pre-Christian warrior cults, where manhood and metal were inseparable. Others argue it's entirely a Christian rebranding of older fertility customs, where the sword replaced the phallus as a more appropriate symbol of union and potency. Either way, the symbolism is as subtle as a trebuchet, and yet the moment is strangely intimate. You and your spouse lie on either side of the sword, eyes meeting across the steel. Neither of you knows exactly what to say. You're tired. You're overwhelmed. There's a goat under the bed, a relic on the table, and about 6 relatives probably still camped out in the hallway waiting to interview your linen. But here you are, separated by this ancient symbol, trying to make sense of what it means to wake up married in a world where even your sheets have a reputation to uphold. In some versions of the ceremony, the couple was expected to sleep that entire first night without touching. Chaste, contemplative, perhaps even fasting. The real consummation in those traditions came the next day, after prayers and public blessings. The sword in those cases wasn't a mere symbol of union. It was a test. Could the couple resist temptation? Could they begin their marriage with patience and virtue? In reality, most people probably fail that test by around midnight. You don't sleep much, not with the cold steel just inches away and centuries of tradition breathing down your neck. But eventually your eyes grow heavy, and the last thing you see before sleep overtakes you is the fire's final glow dancing along the sword's blade. A glimmer, a shimmer, then darkness, at last. And then a rooster crows. The rooster crows again, and again. And you swear it's not just one rooster, it's a whole militia. Somewhere beyond the shuttered window, the sky is still a muddy grey, and the first scent of morning dew is creeping in through the stone walls. You've had, at best, 3 hours of sleep. Your limbs are tangled in heavy wool sheets, and your head is pounding, not from wine, but from tradition fatigue. You'd think the madness would end now, at the break of dawn. But this is medieval Europe, and the sun doesn't rise on reason. It rises on ritual. There's a sudden commotion at the door, feet pounding, voices raised in cheerful, drunken delight. The door bursts open, and in floods a horde of young men, groomsmen, cousins, friends of your new in-laws, and perhaps a few stragglers from the feast who just wandered in hoping for leftovers. They're here not to congratulate you, not to bring breakfast, not even to take the goat back to its pen. They're here to kidnap you. Or more accurately, to stage your kidnapping, a bizarre and surprisingly common medieval wedding tradition, known in many regions as the bride smuggling. In some parts of France it was called l'enlèvement de la mariée. In England it was just the carry-off. The rules were hazy, the consent murky at best, and the spectacle guaranteed. Before you can process what's happening, your spouse is pulled from the bed with a mixture of laughter and feigned resistance. The men hoot and cheer, wrapping them in a robe and shoving something into their hand, a wooden cup or a small ceremonial item, before sweeping them away in a flurry of boots and chaos. Someone trips over the sword on the floor, another stumbles and knocks over the leftover wine jug, the bishop's scroll nearly gets trampled, and then they're gone, off down the corridor laughing and singing some kind of celebratory nonsense. You're left sitting alone in bed, sheets askew, hair wild, one slipper missing, wondering what exactly just happened. This bride smuggling, or occasionally groom smuggling, just depending on the tradition, had roots in both symbolism and farce. In some cultures, it was a mock reenactment of the bride capture myth, an old folkloric narrative where the groom had to earn his bride through strength or cunning. In more Christianized settings, it was reframed as a test of community involvement. The groom's friends would steal away the bride, and the groom, the household, had to bargain or perform a task to get them back. If you're the bride in this case, congratulations, you've been stolen by your new family. In some variations, they parade you through the village, sometimes barefoot, sometimes on a donkey. while the townspeople cheer and toss flower petals or bits of bread. The implication is that you've been officially taken from your birth family and are now the property of your new one. A little light-hearted patriarchy to start your morning. If you're the groom, your job is either to rescue your spouse or complete some absurd challenge to earn them back. That could mean chopping wood, herding animals, running a race, or, if you're lucky, just paying a few coins to an aunt pretending to be a captor. In noble households, the stakes might be higher. There are records of grooms being asked to duel a cousin in mock combat, or compose a love poem on the spot to win back their partner. Poetry under duress. Very medieval. One fringe account from 15th century Wales describes a bride being kidnapped and tied to a kitchen chair, while her groom had to navigate a drunken obstacle course of overturned barrels, slippery goose fat, and hostile relatives with ladles. The event was apparently so chaotic that it became a local legend, and the couple were nicknamed the Barrel Lovers for the rest of their lives. Romantic. In some places, this tradition was a full-day affair. You might spend the entire morning being led from house to house, as neighbours offered symbolic gifts, eggs, coins, sweet rolls, to help ransom the bride back to her groom. The idea wasn't to make you suffer. It was to embed you deeper into the community. You weren't just marrying a person, you were marrying a village, and that village now had a stake in your success, whether you liked it or not. Historians remain divided on how seriously to take this ritual. Some argue it was pure theatre, a comical way to extend the wedding festivities. Others note that its roots in real bride capture practices, where women were forcibly taken from one tribe or village to another, give it an uncomfortable undertone. Even the term mock abduction sounds a little too close to the real thing, and in many records the line between joke and coercion is blurred. Still, for many medieval couples, the smuggling was simply another stop on the gauntlet of marriage customs, something to endure before they could collapse into a quiet life of shared property and endless ploughing. The agricultural kind, mostly. And for the villagers, it was one last excuse to eat, drink, and chant inappropriate verses before heading back to their normal lives of mud, taxes, and plague. You, meanwhile, are finally pulled from bed by the women of the household who arrive minutes later with more fresh clothes, another jug of water, and an exasperated look that says, "Come on, they're waiting." Your hair is combed, your gown is hastily laced, a pair of dried flower petals are plucked from your pillow, someone wipes a smudge of mead from your cheek with a motherly thumb. You're led out into the morning light, blinking against the sun, where a small crowd is already gathered. Your spouse is standing awkwardly nearby, sheepishly holding a rooster and a flagon. You raise an eyebrow, they shrug. You both look ridiculous. And somewhere in the crowd, someone shouts, "Now that's a proper marriage!" Everyone cheers. You can't tell if it's genuine or ironic anymore. Probably both. You've survived the goat under the bed, the sword in the sheets, the mid-feast serenade, and now, apparently, a staged kidnapping. As you're reunited with your slightly rumpled spouse beneath a garland-draped arch, you're just starting to think, maybe, this whole ordeal is finally winding down. But then a loud sneeze echoes through the courtyard. One sneeze, then two. Someone gasps. Heads turn. An old woman crosses herself. A baby starts crying. And just like that, your future may have just been cursed. Welcome to medieval omen watching, the bizarre habit of interpreting everything on and around your wedding night, sounds, smells, shadows, accidents, as divine signs of how your marriage would unfold. This wasn't just idle superstition. These were serious, inherited beliefs passed down through generations, and they carried the same weight as actual laws. Possibly more. You and your partner are now the unwilling protagonists in a game of celestial charades, and everything from the direction of the wind to the number of times someone burps at breakfast is a sign. The sneeze, that's trouble. A single sneeze during a wedding or consummation-related ritual was often seen as a warning. An ill wind, a jealous spirit, or worse, a sign of infertility. 2 sneezes, depending on the region, might counteract it. 3. Weirdly, those meant prosperity and twins. The logic is hazy, but the reactions are not. People care. Your mother-in-law has already started muttering something under her breath. A priest nearby frowns toward the heavens. Someone brings over a bit of salted bread and presses it into your hand. For balance, they say. A young cousin sprints off to find a sprig of mugwort. You're not entirely sure what's happening anymore, but you smile and nod like a professional hostage. Omen watching didn't stop with sneezing. All around the wedding bed and the wedding chamber, people watched for signs. Did the candles burn evenly? Good sign. Did one gutter out during the ceremony? Bad. Was the fire in the hearth bright and clean? Excellent. Did the logs spit and crack loudly during the bedding? Terrible. In fact, popping wood was so feared in certain German regions that couples would place a damp cloth in the fire to muffle any suspicious cracks. You're not trying to have your lineage derailed by a rogue log. And then there were the dreams. The morning after, older women of the household, usually aunts or grandmothers, would gather in the kitchen or common room to speculate over their own dreams from the night. These weren't just idle conversations. If Aunt Gertrude dreamt of a black dog, the couple was doomed. If a cousin dreamt of white bread, the couple would have sons. An owl in a dream, infidelity. A pig, wealth. An open door. That one depended entirely on who you asked and how much wine they'd had. You might be thinking, surely people didn't take this too seriously, right? Oh, but they did. There are records of weddings being redone, entirely repeated, because of a bad omen during the original bedding ceremony. One countess in 14th century France reportedly demanded a second marriage blessing because a crow landed on her windowsill during the initial consummation. The bishop perhaps wisely agreed. Then there's the matter of shadows. Yes, even your shadow could reveal your fate. Couples were often positioned by firelight on their first night together, so that older relatives could observe the shapes their shadows made on the wall. If the shadows blended well, moving together harmoniously, showing balance and alignment, it meant a strong union. If they moved separately, flickered oddly, or appeared broken, it was said that the couple would live divided in heart. You're lying there, exhausted and slightly tipsy, and someone is whispering, "Her elbow's shadow is too far from his." It's a sign, and you're just trying not to laugh, or cry. A fringe tradition from parts of rural Norway involved releasing a pigeon into the room shortly after the couple entered. If the pigeon circled once and flew out the window, the couple would have many children. If it crashed into something or landed on the bed, the couple would struggle. If the pigeon relieved itself in the room, the couple would be wealthy but unhappy. It's basically a medieval version of reading tea leaves, but with more feathers and danger to soft furnishings. There was even a belief that the couple's first coordinated movement, something as small as reaching for the same goblet or speaking at the same time, was a predictor. If the groom reached first, he would lead. If the bride did, she would be strong-willed. If neither reached, and someone else handed them the item, the marriage would be dominated by family. These micro-omens were whispered about endlessly, and like everything else, once the gossip started, it never stopped. Modern scholars see these omen traditions as fascinating insight into medieval psychology. When life was short, uncertain, and wildly out of individual control, people sought structure in chaos. Watching for omens gave them a sense of power, if not over the future, then at least over the story they told about it. It also served as social glue. Everyone had a stake in interpreting the signs, discussing them, spinning them into communal meaning. A sneeze wasn't just a sneeze, it was the whole village's business. You, unfortunately, are now the sneeze. You sit on a bench while an old woman waves a bundle of dried herbs around your head. You have no idea what they are. She's mumbling something in a dialect that sounds like Old Prussian and cursing someone named Edelgard. You accept this. You've accepted so much by now. Your spouse returns with a sheepish smile and a mug of morning beer. Yes, beer. sitting beside you as if this is all entirely normal. You both watch as the woman finishes her herbal smudging and declares, "It is balanced." You exhale. The crowd relaxes. The rooster crows again, but this time no one reacts. Maybe the third crow cancels out the first. Maybe they're just tired. Or maybe they've finally moved on to the next ritual. Of course, they haven't. You've been blessed, stripped, serenaded, feasted, kidnapped, and saged, and it's still not even noon. You're starting to understand that medieval marriage wasn't just a ceremony, it was a multi-day endurance test with costumes, live animals, and exactly zero personal boundaries. And speaking of costumes, you glance down at the outfit someone just handed you. You blink. It's made of leather, and fur, and feathers. Your spouse is standing nearby holding a similarly ridiculous get-up, complete with a belt of tiny bells and a felt hat shaped like a hawk's head. This, apparently, is your next trial, the Virgin Hunter Procession. In certain parts of Central and Northern Europe, especially in Germanic and Nordic regions, the wedding morning kicked off with an event that was part ritual, part roleplay, and part elaborate community cosplay. The groom would dress as a symbolic hunter, and the bride as a creature to be caught or claimed, usually a deer, dove, or sometimes a fox, depending on local legend. You'd think this might be a quiet, symbolic little thing. But no, it's a parade. Through town. A crowd gathers outside the manor, cheering as you're dressed and prepared like the main act in a low-budget pageant. The hunter costume includes a wooden spear, blunt, hopefully, a satchel filled with bread for the journey, and often some kind of embroidered sash covered in fertility symbols, antlers, grapes, flowers, or in one unfortunate case what's clearly just a stylized phallus repeated across the hem. The bride's outfit is lighter, layered with gauzy veils or woodland-coloured fabric, sometimes with leaves or feathers pinned into the hair. You are prey and predator, and it's all very theatrical. This tradition isn't about literal hunting, it's symbolic. The groom is reenacting the pursuit of the maiden, a metaphorical chase that represents courtship, conquest, and eventual union. Yes, the themes are about as subtle as a sword to the forehead, but the community treats it like a beloved folk play, and as the couple steps outside to begin the procession, they're cheered, blessed, and sometimes pelted with handfuls of flower petals or rye grains. In some villages, the bride has to escape the house through a back door or garden gate, while the groom hunts her with his friends, who yell helpful advice like, "She went that way," even when she clearly didn't. It's staged, of course. You're not meant to sprint barefoot through the brambles, though according to one bizarre 15th century diary entry from Bavaria, a particularly athletic bride once dodged her groom for 2 full hours and had to be found asleep in a hayloft. You and your spouse begin the walk through town, accompanied by drummers, fiddlers, and that one guy who insists on playing the bagpipes. Townsfolk gather to watch. Children follow, giggling. Old women toss herbs and shout unsolicited advice. Some yell things like, "Catch her gently," or "Mind the spear," and you realise with horrifying clarity that they've all seen this dozens of times and probably have favourite performances. A fringe twist from parts of Estonia includes a brief duel between the groom and a male relative of the bride, sometimes her brother, sometimes her father, using sticks or padded clubs. The goal? Symbolically defeat the protectors of the maiden. You get bonus points if you do it while balancing a jug of beer. In reality, the duel is more slapstick than serious, and someone always falls into a trough, usually on purpose. If this whole display feels a bit pagan, that's because it is. These rituals trace their roots back to ancient fertility rites and folk legends, where love and mating were framed as cosmic chases, echoes of Artemis and Actaeon, Freya and her suitors, even pre-Christian spirits of spring. Over time they were folded into Christian marriage ceremonies under the guise of community bonding and cultural continuity. But the underlying message stayed the same. The groom must earn his bride. Even if they're already legally married, even if they already consummated, even if the goat saw everything. Not all towns did this in public. In more private households, the hunt happened indoors, sometimes with riddles or obstacle courses. The bride might hide in a linen closet or behind a tapestry, while the groom wandered around pretending to be baffled. In one particularly theatrical court in Bohemia, the hunt was performed on a makeshift stage complete with props, costumes, and a full script. Imagine being half hungover and having to improvise forest animal metaphors while your in-laws clap enthusiastically from the front row. Now, here's a quirky fact. In parts of Poland and Slovakia, instead of the groom hunting the bride, it was reversed. The bride would wield a symbolic whip made of braided herbs and strike the groom on the back as he walked ahead of her through the village, driving him toward the home they'd now share. Symbolically, it meant she was taking control of the domestic space, leading him to the hearth. Also symbolically, it meant, don't screw this up. As the procession nears its end, you're expected to stop at 3 thresholds, one at a garden gate, one at the church, and one at your new home. Each pause represents a stage of transformation: courtship, union, and domestic life. At each stop, an elder or officiant offers a small blessing or object: bread, salt, flowers, a coin, or in some places a dried chicken foot. No one ever explains the chicken foot. You finally return to the house, now transformed from the blushing bride and stoic groom into the hunter and the one. The symbolism is complete. Everyone claps. Someone plays a triumphant horn flourish on a flute that squeaks halfway through. The dog barks, the goat bleats, the villagers cheer, your costume itches, your feet hurt. Your pride is complicated, but there's a strange satisfaction in it too. You've played your part. You've walked the line between myth and marriage. You've performed for a village and a legacy. And now, finally, maybe, hopefully, you're allowed to sit down. Just as you're reaching for a drink, a booming voice calls out, "And now, the stew!" Of course, there's a stew. The stew is brought out like it's the Holy Grail, a steaming, bubbling cauldron balanced on a wooden plank between 2 red-faced uncles, followed by a procession of kitchen servants, ale carriers, and a choir of deeply suspicious smells. You're barely back from your ridiculous hunter-prey performance, your hair still tangled with feathers, your costume crusted with dried flour paste and sweat, when someone thrusts a wooden bowl into your hands and ladles in a thick brown slop that smells vaguely of roasted boar and licorice. This is no ordinary soup. This is the wedding stew, the medieval aphrodisiac power broth, made according to recipes passed down from generations of midwives, grandmothers, and deeply overconfident herbalists. Forget oysters and champagne. In medieval Europe, if you wanted passion, endurance, and a guaranteed bouncing air within 9 months, you reached for the cauldron, and then you prayed. The stew is hot, rich, and uncomfortably pungent. Chunks of meat bob on the surface, alongside wilted herbs, mysterious roots, and possibly a claw. You don't ask. You sip carefully, trying not to breathe through your nose. Someone leans over your shoulder and says, "That'll wake your loins." You nod politely and take another scalding gulp. You're too tired to fight. This stew, sometimes called bed broth, bridal brew, or the much less charming lover's slop, was custom in many medieval households, especially on the day after the wedding night. It was believed to replenish what had been spent in the night, and to stoke whatever embers might be smouldering for round 2. It usually included some kind of meat, rich with fat and protein, warming herbs like ginger, clove and pepper, and a healthy splash of ale or wine. Occasionally, it was thickened with blood. Animal blood, ideally. Sometimes not. If your family was wealthy, the stew might contain exotic ingredients like saffron, nutmeg, or even cinnamon imported at great expense. If you were rural or poor, the stew might lean on onions, turnips, and whatever was still twitching in the henhouse. Either way, it was meant to be consumed quickly, hungrily, and with lots of cheering from your extended family. You're still chewing your first bite when a cousin raises a tankard and bellows, To vigorous love and many sons, everyone toasts. Your spoon pauses mid-air, and of course, like everything else on this never-ending wedding circuit, the stew is laced with meaning. Every ingredient has a purpose. Boar meat for strength and virility, parsley for fertility, garlic to ward off evil spirits, and in some interpretations to stir the blood, honey to sweeten the womb, carrots for, well, the obvious. You sip slowly and try not to imagine what else might be lurking in the broth. In parts of Italy, the stew was spiced with rue and basil, both herbs associated with sexual vitality and, oddly, patience. In Slavic regions, there was a preference for cabbage-based stews with heavy cream stirred in at the last minute. According to one 14th century herbal manual, this made the mixture smooth the humours of the womb. That's a phrase you didn't want to hear before breakfast. And sometimes it wasn't stew at all. It was a porridge, a pudding, or even a weird sort of jelly. In Denmark they served a lumpy pink gruel made of barley, pig's blood, and rose petals. It was called brudelob, and it was said to bring a dreamy haze to the couple's next encounter. A dreamy haze or food poisoning, possibly both. A fringe fact: in certain Romanian villages, a hedgehog egg, yes, you heard that right, would be crushed into the stew, based on the belief that it would make the bride clever and quiet, and the groom brave like the spiked one. This was deeply impractical, considering hedgehogs don't lay eggs, but superstition has never let biology get in the way. As you eat, older guests begin to tell stories, some sweet, some wildly inappropriate. One man claims he fathered 12 children after a stew thickened with deer marrow and a whisper of badger. Another swears that putting an acorn in the pot guaranteed twins. A third aunt insists that if you don't finish your bowl, the spirits of unmarried ancestors will haunt your bed for 9 nights. She stares at you while you chew. You finish the bowl. After the eating comes the next part, the stew blessing. Because why just eat a cauldron of mystery meat when you can also have it richly anointed? A local priest or healer stands and mutters a few words over the pot, sprinkling in some extra herbs and making the sign of the cross, or a fertility rune, depending on the village. Then the pot is paraded around, and guests drop in small tokens: rings, feathers, coins, dried flowers, even buttons. These items are later collected, wrapped in linen, and given to the couple as a kind of good luck charm, or shoved under the bed for reasons you don't ask about anymore. Some traditions require the couple to stir the pot together using a shared wooden spoon. This is meant to symbolize unity, cooperation, and shared destiny. Other interpretations say it's about mixing your energies. A more cynical cousin whispers that it's just to prove neither of you is left-handed, which was still considered suspicious in many parts of Europe. Modern scholars are still baffled by how seriously these stews were taken. Were they actual aphrodisiacs? Probably not. Were they symbolic power rituals wrapped in soup form? Absolutely. They offered structure, reassurance, and a common table around which families could gather and convince themselves that everything was working according to plan. You sit back, belly full, mildly confused, and uncertain whether you've just been blessed or cursed. The empty bowl is taken from your lap. A spoon clinks into a bucket. Someone passes you a cloth to wipe your mouth. A pair of children are dancing near the hearth, pretending to stir an imaginary stew of their own. You glance at your spouse, who looks just as dazed as you feel. You share a slow nod. You both survive the stew, and then the door swings open. Again. Because now it's time to count the coins. Just as you're beginning to feel the subtle lull of food coma pulling you toward blissful unconsciousness, someone dumps a jingling leather pouch onto the bed in front of you. Silver coins scatter across the blankets, rolling over wrinkles in the linen like tiny glinting beetles. A few bounce onto the floor, one lands in your lap. You blink at it, then at the person grinning proudly over the heap of currency, your new father-in-law, holding the now empty pouch aloft like a victorious pirate. It's time for the dowry display, also known as the bedpost offering, or in some parts of medieval Europe, counting the silver. And yes, it's exactly what it sounds like. Your marriage bed is now also your accounting desk. This particular tradition varies across cultures, but the underlying idea remains the same. Someone, usually the groom's family, piles the dowry coins, actual metal, currency, on or around the marital bed on the morning after the wedding. Why? To prove the transaction has been completed, to bless the couple with visible wealth, and to physically anchor prosperity to the place where new life is expected to begin. Medieval logic is a strange and literal thing. The coins aren't just tossed casually, they're arranged. Placed atop the headboard, stacked at the 4 bedposts hidden under pillows, tucked into your shoes. Some are tied into the folds of the bed linens. A few have even been sewn into the hem of the bride's wedding robe, which explains why you've been walking around jingling like a haunted purse. You and your spouse are handed small wooden bowls and expected to help collect and count the coins aloud. The counting is ceremonial, not just mathematical. Each number is followed by a whispered blessing or proverb from the crowd. 1 for joy, 2 for health, 3 for strong sons, 4 for no miscarriages, 5 for land. It keeps going. Some make them up as they go. One uncle says, 10 for cows that don't kick. You just nod. The symbolism here is thick. Money, in medieval Europe, wasn't just economic, it was generational. The dowry you brought into the marriage, or the bridal gift from the groom's family, was proof of alliance, status, and intentions. In noble households, it was a declaration of power. Among peasants, it was survival. The display of the coins on the marriage bed was a signal to the entire community that the union had been sealed with value, monetary, reproductive, and spiritual. But it didn't stop at simple coins. In parts of Eastern Europe, families would include small gold medallions stamped with religious figures, tiny icons of saints, often sewn into the bridal shift or slipped under the mattress. In wealthier towns, a dowry chest might be wheeled into the room with dramatic flair, then ceremonially opened in front of witnesses. Silk handkerchiefs, silver spoons, lengths of fine linen, and even livestock vouchers might spill out in a dramatic cascade of virtue and financial leverage. And here's a fringe fact for you. In 13th century Venice, some families dyed their coins with saffron or cinnabar before the wedding to tint them red or gold. This was supposed to make the wealth more fertile. Unfortunately, cinnabar is toxic mercury sulfide, so this beautiful gesture probably led to more curses than children. Meanwhile, in certain alpine villages, coins weren't just counted, they were bitten. No, really. The bride or groom, or both, were expected to bite one of the largest coins during the ceremony. If they dented it, it meant strength. If not, they were considered too soft, and possibly lacking in the physical robustness required for parenthood. You can practically hear the enamel cracking. Some families went even further. In parts of Germany and Bohemia, they'd hide coins around the house during the wedding day. Each coin, the bride, found symbolized a future child. Some hid up to 12. One record tells of a bride who found 15, panicked, and threw 3 into the river. Her husband fished them out. They had 17 children. The math checks out. Somehow. Back in your bedchamber, the counting continues. A scribe is literally sitting on a stool near the fire, writing down the total in a thick ledger, cross-referencing it with the pre-wedding agreements. Occasionally, someone in the crowd murmurs approval, a generous gift, or that'll buy them a new plough, or enough to replace the goat at least. You glance under the bed. The goat seems insulted. The act of counting the dowry on the bed itself is as symbolic as it is practical. It links wealth and fertility in a tangible way. This is the bed where children are expected to be made. This is where love meets legacy. In a world where so much could go wrong, war, disease, bad weather, bandit raids, this moment, loud and glittering and public, offers reassurance. You have a future. You have a stake. You have silver under your pillow. Of course, all of this comes with immense pressure. If your dowry is meagre, people notice. They talk. A small pile of coins can mean whispers, snubs, or jokes from older relatives. In some traditions, the couple was given a symbolic wooden coin, shaped like a full silver piece but hollow, if they were deemed too poor to count publicly. A wish for prosperity, they'd say, smiling. But everyone knew it was a pity token. On the flip side, a massive dowry could attract envy, accusations of overcompensation, or even spiritual worry. One Lithuanian tradition involved burning a small corner of the dowry pouch before counting the coins, to let the spirits take their share. You watch as someone subtly touches a coin to the hearthstone, maybe for luck, maybe for cleansing, maybe just because Aunt Matilda insists on doing it every time. Finally, the counting is done. The coins are swept up into a lidded box sealed with a family emblem and handed to the couple. You're expected to keep this box near the bed for the first month of marriage. Not under the mattress, though. Too risky. One wrong move and you've got a dented shin and a shattered legacy. You lean back on your elbows, watching as the last few guests file out, murmuring about numbers, blessings, and whether the stew was too salty. The bed is rumpled. The linens smell like clove and ash. Your fingers are still tacky with honey and coin dust. You close your eyes, which means naturally that someone is about to start a fight. It begins, as these things often do, with shouting. Not the celebratory kind. No drunken chants about virility or wine-fueled ballads about love's eternal flame. No, this is sharper, heavier. Something in the tone drops like a barrel slamming shut. You and your spouse are still lounging on the slightly damp, heavily dowried bed when the first crash echoes down the hall. A tankard, maybe, or a chair, possibly a body. You both sit up at the same time, and just like that, the wedding night transitions into its next traditional phase, the post-consummation brawl. Yes, a real fight. Usually between guests, sometimes between family members, occasionally, deeply regrettably, between entire villages. The morning after a medieval wedding night was, in many regions, considered the perfect moment to let buried grudges surface. Think of it as a celebratory pressure release, except instead of hugs, there are haymakers. The logic, while not exactly airtight, was surprisingly accepted. With all the stress, spectacle, wine, and forced ritual surrounding the wedding night, tensions naturally ran high. Add in the public bedding, the family politics, the dowry counting, and that time someone got trampled during the bride smuggling, and you had yourself a powder keg in a woolen tunic. Some cultures even encouraged it. In certain parts of southern France and the Pyrenees, this post-wedding brawl was known as le rite de la querelle, the rite of the quarrel. A semi-staged scuffle would break out among the men, and sometimes the women, after the stew and dowry rituals had concluded. The idea was that one final burst of chaos would purify the household. Better to get the conflict out now in front of witnesses than let it fester under the surface of a newly formed alliance. You hear another crash. A dog yelps. Someone yells, "You owe me that duck!" Another voice bellows, "It wasn't even your duck!" followed by an unmistakable thwack. A bucket goes skittering past the chamber door. A lute string snaps mid-chord. You rush to the doorway in time to see your cousin, shirtless and red-faced, being dragged backward by the collar of his tunic while a man with one shoe wields a salami like a club. Another guest is chasing someone around a table with what appears to be a stale loaf of wedding bread. The goat is screaming. You blink. You close the door again. In certain Slavic and Baltic traditions, a morning-after fight was symbolic of the couple's strength to weather storms. If the wedding party could clash and survive, so too could the marriage. Some households even staged these brawls intentionally, assigning roles to relatives, one to start it, one to try breaking it up, one to hide the wine. There were rules, no weapons, no bleeding, and no interrupting the bride's breakfast. Other than that, go wild. In the Low Countries, it was known as the Brawl of Good Fortune. If the brawl broke out before noon, it meant prosperity. After noon, a long marriage, but likely one with frequent arguments. If someone got dunked in water, typically a barrel or well, it meant the marriage would be blessed with fertility. If someone's clothes were torn, it meant one of the couple would shed their selfishness. If two relatives both lost a shoe, twins. A fringe account from rural Croatia tells of a groom's uncle and the bride's grandfather getting into a tug of war over a roast chicken leg which escalated into a flour sack duel in the courtyard. The rest of the guests began taking bets. The couple, they danced through it. Everyone agreed it was a good sign. The chicken leg was never recovered. Back in your manor hall, the chaos has reached its zenith. A pitcher of ale is upended, a tablecloth becomes a cape. Two elderly women are yelling contradictory prophecies about what it means when a candlestick rolls toward the fireplace. Your spouse turns to you looking for some signal, some response. But what can you do? This is apparently tradition. You shrug. They shrug. You both lean against the doorframe and watch the madness unfold. It's absurd. But in a way, it's also release. All the pressure of the wedding, the weight of ceremony, the bizarre obligations. You couldn't cry, couldn't complain, couldn't really feel anything except gratitude and composure. And now? Now your uncle is trying to crawl into a barrel to avoid a flying honey cake. Now the pressure is gone. Historians believe these outbursts weren't merely tolerated. They were woven into the wedding ritual precisely because they served a purpose. Medieval life, after all, wasn't peaceful. Conflict was expected. Family feuds were real. And weddings merged more than hearts. They merged estates, rivalries, and histories. Letting everyone throw a punch or two, within reason, created a symbolic clearing of the air. In fact, some households recorded the brawls right alongside wedding details in the family ledger. Married on the Feast of St. Giles, brawl erupted over spilled wine, resolved with apologies and 3 roasted ducks. There are even a few surviving woodcuts showing scenes of wedding feasts with fists raised, chairs flying, and priests discreetly sipping wine in the background. You watch as the dust begins to settle. A few guests are panting, laughing, shaking hands. A man with flour in his beard raises a mug and offers a toast to hot blood and cooler heads. Someone sings the wrong verse of the wedding song. Everyone joins in. It's terrible and somehow perfect. The goat is chewing on someone's discarded belt. You retreat to the bed, slipping your arm around your spouse, who still smells faintly of stew and pine smoke. The fighting is over, for now. The family has blown off steam. The legacy can continue, slightly bruised but bonded. Somewhere in the hallway someone says, "Next time we just settle it with dice." A hopeful voice replies, "Or archery." But before anyone can start loading crossbows, a bell rings in the distance. It's time to dance on the bed. You've just managed to settle back into the creaky comfort of the marriage bed. Flour-streaked, stew-stuffed, and emotionally flattened, when the door bursts open yet again, and 6 relatives flood in with the manic cheer of people who've either forgotten what you've endured, or simply don't care. They're singing, clapping, and they're headed straight for the bed, boots muddy and spirits high. One woman claps her hands and declares with alarming authority, "Time to dance on the marriage bed." You blink. Surely this is metaphorical. Surely she means around the bed, or near the bed. But no. You're unceremoniously ushered to the side as boots are kicked off, cloaks tossed aside, and people start actually climbing onto your mattress like it's a stage. The marriage bed, in many parts of medieval Europe, wasn't just a place of consummation and symbolic union. It was also a dance floor, a literal one. In households from Ireland to Hungary, there was a common post-wedding tradition where family and friends would climb onto the marriage bed, sometimes with the couple, sometimes without, and bounce, stomp, jig, or flat-out leap as a show of joy, good fortune, and surprise, fertility. One man is already doing a bizarre side hop that looks like a sheep trying to swim. Someone else has begun clapping overhead in time with the music, which is being played badly on a hurdy-gurdy by a cousin who only knows 3 notes. You and your spouse are pulled up by your elbows and placed barefoot on the mattress like newly crowned royalty at a barn dance. The bed groans under the weight. The sword, forgotten at the foot, gets kicked aside. A few coins from the dowry box rattle out and disappear between the floorboards. No one cares. The crowd is in full swing now, bouncing up and down, shaking the posts, laughing, hollering and chanting nonsensical wedding rhymes with the chaotic energy of people possessed. Why the bed, you ask? Because like everything else in this whirlwind of symbolic insanity, the bed is sacred. It is the womb of the household. It is the place where life begins, where lineage grows, and where, if you're lucky, no one gets trampled by an uncle doing a handstand. Dancing on the bed was believed to awaken it, rouse the spirits of fertility, shake loose any bad omens, and bless the space with movement and heat. In French households, the tradition was called la danse du lit, and it was often led by the mothers of the bride and groom. They would climb onto the bed together and perform a slow, bouncing chant, occasionally joined by sisters or younger cousins. In English villages it was known more informally as bed thumping, and the goal was less choreography, more noise. The louder the bed creaked, the more promising the union. There's a moment now where your spouse nearly falls backward into the relic table, catching themselves just in time with a yelp and a grin. You reach out to steady them, and in doing so, the two of you stumble together and land on the bed in a tangled heap. The crowd cheers like you've just won a tournament. A flower crown lands on your head. You no longer know who you are or what your life was before all this. The dancing continues. Someone lifts a toddler up and plops them onto the bed. The child bounces gleefully, waving a crust of wedding bread like a royal sceptre. "Bring more children," someone shouts. "Fill this bed with laughter." You laugh too, though your thighs are burning and your dignity left the room 4 rituals ago. In Scandinavian versions of the tradition, the newlyweds would be expected to perform a specific step. 1 foot on the edge of the bed frame, 1 in the centre, arms raised, spinning in unison. It was thought that this exact motion would align their energies. If either lost balance or stepped on the other's foot, it was taken as a sign that they'd argue often. You and your spouse try it. You make it halfway through before collapsing in laughter, and someone shouts, "That's love!" A fringe variation from a 15th century Austrian village had guests take turns leaping over the couple as they lay on the bed. Yes, like some sort of romantic livestock hurdle. The idea was to jump over temptation, or perhaps just see who was the most limber after 6 mugs of cider. One infamous wedding recorded in a court ledger noted that a guest sprained both ankles attempting a triple flip. His name? Still part of local law. You finally slide down to the foot of the bed, breathless, sweaty, and half buried in wool. The mattress now smells like cider, garlic, rose petals, and wet sock. The linens are crumpled. The relic table is knocked slightly askew, and a boot has found its way under your pillow. The goat watches silently from the corner, judging, always judging. Dancing on the bed served as a kind of communal spell, equal parts magic, bonding, and insanity. Modern anthropologists see it as an embodied way of saying, "We were here. We celebrated you. We shook this house to bless your life. It's loud, it's chaotic, but it's also kind of beautiful, in that way only completely unhinged traditions can be." Finally, someone calls out, "The bed has been danced," and the crowd slowly begins to climb down, giggling, brushing off their robes, wiping ale from their brows. Someone hands you a goblet. You sip. It's apple wine and cloves and possibly someone's hair. You don't care. You've reached a state beyond exhaustion, beyond logic. You've gone full medieval. And just as the last reveller stumbles out the door, the floor creaks again. You glance over your shoulder. There's a priest standing there. Again. And this time, he's not coming to bless you. He's coming to hide. You lock eyes with him, this wide-eyed, nervous priest, and immediately understand 2 things. 1, he's absolutely not supposed to be here. And 2, he's about to crawl into your wardrobe. He darts across the threshold like a man being chased by wolves, muttering apologies in badly muffled Latin as he ducks behind a tapestry, then changes his mind and wedges himself inside a narrow closet near the hearth. You hear a thump, a rustle, and the telltale creak of ancient hinges trying not to betray him. The smell of lavender sachets and priestly panic lingers in the air. You turn to your spouse, they turn to you. Neither of you speaks, because this, somehow, has become normal. The priest in the closet isn't part of a secret affair or fleeing some angry monk mob. He's part of another wedding night tradition, one that scholars still argue about, but which appears in enough court records, household letters, and scandalous poems to confirm its uncomfortable reality, the ritual of hidden spiritual supervision. That's right. In certain corners of medieval Europe, especially among pious or superstitious households, a priest might be instructed, or even volunteered, to remain discreetly nearby on the wedding night. Not in the room itself, no, but close, behind a curtain, inside a wardrobe, in a crawl space, just out of sight but spiritually present, like a guardian angel with a bad sense of personal space. You glance toward the wardrobe again. There's a sneeze, a muffled Dominus Vobiscum, then silence. Why, you ask? Because consummation wasn't just a personal act, it was also a divine transaction. Especially among noble families, the expectation was that the first union be as pure, holy, and sacramentally sound as possible, which meant, for some, inviting the church not just into the marriage, but into the bedchamber's immediate vicinity. In some traditions, the priest wouldn't hide. He'd simply sit nearby, perhaps in a high-backed chair behind a screen or in a nearby antechamber with the door slightly ajar. His role was not to observe, but to guard, from sin, from demonic interruption, from any misstep that might render the act invalid in the eyes of God. One 13th century Hungarian marriage record specifies that a priest was to remain within earshot of the bridal suite and recite protective prayers during the entire consummation. There are marginal notes indicating he may have dozed off halfway through. Another account from a Bohemian convent-turned-marriage hall details how a newlywed couple exited their chamber to find the priest had not only overheard them but had taken notes, a helpful list of sins avoided and minor areas of improvement. Bless his heart. Sometimes these hidden guardians were simply symbolic. In parts of Bavaria, placing a priest's garment or holy book in the room served the same purpose. But in more orthodox households, especially those with a saint's relic on the premises, and you definitely have one, an actual priest was considered the gold standard of spiritual protection, and not just from sin. There was a widespread belief that dark spirits, fairies, or incubi might tempt to disrupt the act of consummation. The presence of a priest, even unseen, warded them off. He was there to chant, to pray, to rebuke, to keep the metaphysical vibes pure while you fumbled through a mix of expectation, pressure, and residual goat odour. Here's a fringe detail for you. In parts of rural Spain, there was a tradition known as El Susurro Sagrado, the sacred whisper. A priest would hide behind a wall or curtain and periodically murmur phrases from scripture as the couple progressed through their ritual duties. Be fruitful and multiply was a popular one. Another favourite was, love one another as Christ has loved you. If this seems like a mood killer, that's because it was. You finally stand up, crossing the room to gently tap the closet door. There's a faint squeak, then a breathless "yes" from inside. We're done with the dancing, you say. You can come out now. There's a moment of silence. Then the door cracks open and the priest slowly emerges, blinking in the smoky half-light like a ferret caught under a bucket. He straightens his robes, smooths his hair, and thanks you for your patience. You nod. You don't know why. He blesses the room again, because clearly the first 17 blessings didn't stick, and then, after a few more muttered Latin phrases and a very awkward pause, he departs. You exhale, flopping back onto the mattress. It smells like sweat and cinnamon and communal approval. Your spouse joins you. You both stare at the ceiling, waiting to see if anyone else is going to burst through the door. Nothing, for now. Modern scholars are still puzzled by this phenomenon. Was it truly common? Was it limited to specific regions or religious sects? Was the presence of clergy always literal, or sometimes metaphorical, represented by relics, scripture, or a pious elder nearby? Some argue that the priest in the closet stories are exaggerated, born from satire, folklore, or ecclesiastical paranoia. Others point to the overwhelming control the medieval church exerted over marriage and sexuality, and argue, of course they were there. They were always there, even in your linen closet. And let's not forget the gossip. Whether real or embellished, tales of priests being accidentally locked in chests, or mistaken for burglars while hiding in a wedding suite, became a favourite genre of medieval comedy. One popular play from 15th century Italy, Il Confessore Nascosto, features a priest caught in a laundry basket under the bride's bed, offering whispered advice mid-consummation. It was reportedly a hit. So here you are, married, possibly absolved, probably still being psychically monitored, and for the first time since yesterday morning, your room is still. The relic glows softly in the corner. The goat is asleep with its head tucked into a curtain. The stew pot is empty. The dancing is done. The coins are boxed. The priest is gone. And as your eyes begin to close, your spouse mumbles sleepily, "Do you think he could still hear us?" You don't answer. You're already drifting off. Then, outside the window, the faint ring of a bell. Someone's preparing the naked parade. The bell tolls again. Not the heavy solemn knell of a funeral, nor the sprightly clang of a market day. No, this is the distinct tone of ceremonial absurdity, one you now recognise instinctively. Your eyes flutter open. Your spouse groans beside you. The goat gives a soft snort from the corner. Somewhere outside, a drum joins the bell, followed by what can only be described as an aggressively upbeat flute solo. This can only mean one thing. It's time for the naked parade. You sit up slowly, the sheets now a tangled monument to your defeat. You're already mentally cataloguing the nonsense you've endured. Public bedding, goat charms, stew with aphrodisiac vegetables, relatives dancing on your mattress. And yet, none of it prepared you for this. Because in some particularly festive corners of medieval Europe, the morning after the wedding meant being marched through town, nude, or at least mostly. The tradition, variously called the matrimonial procession, bridal unveiling, or, less delicately, the flesh walk, was often performed in rural villages, especially in regions of southern Germany, parts of France, and isolated stretches of the Balkans. Ostensibly it was meant to honour the couple's rebirth into married life. More practically, it was a chance for the entire town to gawk at your radiant, vulnerable, thoroughly exhausted glory. A banging starts at the door, followed by a voice far too chipper for the hour. "The robes," someone calls. "Where are the bridal robes?" Robes, thank heaven. You breathe a little easier. Maybe the naked part is symbolic. Maybe it just means light linen and a floral crown, something breezy and tasteful. But then a second voice chimes in, an elderly woman from the kitchen staff, with a cackle and "let them be seen as the Lord made them." You and your spouse exchange a look. It is the look of two people trapped in a recurring dream composed entirely of social anxiety and medieval pageantry. The door opens. A trio of women bustles in, bearing what appears to be sheer fabric, not robes, wisps, suggestions of garments. One holds up a long strip of pale silk no thicker than a scarf and declares, "For modesty." She hands it to your spouse. You receive a matching one along with a circlet of ivy and some very confident instructions. Smile. Keep pace. Don't trip. The point of the parade, they explain, is to bless your bodies. These are now the honoured vessels of future children, the physical proof of the union, and, let's be honest, the town's favourite new gossip fodder. Your modesty? Secondary. The goal here is visibility, joy, and mild public embarrassment. In some regions, especially during festival seasons, these processions were full-on theatrical events. The couple would be led by musicians playing loud, lewd ballads, accompanied by dancers or jesters. You'd walk a circuit of the village, stopping at designated blessing spots. The well, the market cross, the granary, where symbolic acts were performed. You might toss a coin into the water. Your spouse might be sprinkled with flour by the miller's wife to ensure bounty. You might both be slapped on the back by the village blacksmith, a gesture that was never fully explained but widely accepted. Now, here's a fringe example from 14th century Switzerland. A couple was led through the streets by a goat wearing a garland of garlic and potatoes. At each stop, villagers tied small charms to the goat's horns, while the newlyweds were pelted with rose petals, grain, and, bizarrely, bits of dried sausage. This was said to blend fertility, fragrance, and savouriness. You begin to suspect the whole town had just invented new reasons to get weird together. You and your spouse are finally dressed in your near-transparent robes and led down the hall toward the courtyard. The morning sun is painfully bright. Bells clang. The flute player is now joined by a drummer with no rhythm, and what might be a small child banging on a cooking pot. The villagers are already lined up along the path, grinning, clapping, nudging each other with every step you take. As you walk, arms linked, the commentary begins. Some is encouraging. A fine pair. Look at those shoulders, sturdy. They'll have twins, you mark my words. Other remarks are less flattering. Is that a bruise or a birthmark? He's got the knees of a dancing pig. I've seen more meat on a fasting monk. It's a gauntlet of cheerfully brutal honesty. One old woman steps forward and sprinkles salt onto your foreheads. A child ties a ribbon around your wrist. A cousin offers a raw egg and tells you to throw it behind you without looking. You do. It hits the drummer. Everyone cheers. And yet, underneath the nonsense, something else bubbles up. A strange sense of camaraderie. These people aren't mocking you. Not really. They're initiating you, baptizing you into the daily chaos of community life. Everyone has done this, or watched it done. Your bodies, your marriage, your fumbling first night, none of it belongs only to you. It belongs to them. This village, this household, this inherited ritual madness. Historians still debate the origins of the naked parade. Some claim it stems from ancient fertility processions, pagan rites where nude figures embodied purity and power. Others believe it was adapted from Roman wedding customs, where brides were shown publicly to mark the transfer of guardianship from father to husband. Some even think it's a ritual humiliation transformed into celebratory theatre. Either way, it persisted in one form or another for hundreds of years. Eventually the parade ends at your new home's threshold. A bowl of milk is poured out. A loaf of bread is broken and shared between you. A final chant is sung, off-key but heartfelt. And then, blessedly, the doors are shut. Inside, you collapse into a chair. Your spouse strips off the ceremonial scarf and throws it into the hearth. You exhale, finally, completely, ready to sleep for a week. And just when your eyes begin to flutter shut, there's a knock at the door. Someone hands you a charm and a curse. The charm is small, just a pouch of faded linen, tied shut with rough twine and warm from someone's palm. You hold it gingerly, as if it might wriggle. It smells like dried herbs, soil, and a faint trace of iron. Your spouse peers over your shoulder, eyebrows raised. From the doorway, the woman who handed it to you, stooped, veiled, and very clearly not part of the earlier festivities, gives a toothless smile and says, "May your womb be full, or not." Then she turns and disappears down the corridor without another word. You're left holding what you're now told is your fertility charm. Or curse. It depends. Because in medieval Europe, no wedding night was truly complete without a visit from the village wise woman, or cunning woman, midwife witch, herb mother, or that one you go to when the priest is out of ideas. And her job? To deliver a charm that could either help you conceive, or ensure you didn't. The pouch trembles faintly in your hand as you untie the knot and peek inside. Dried lavender, nettle, something resembling a mouse toe, though you hope it's just a root, and, yes, a small coin pierced with a nail. Symbolically, this means many things: protection, prosperity, fertility, and sometimes revenge. Sometimes all at once. Your spouse, ever the optimist, pulls a similar pouch from their own robe pocket. Inside is a different mix: pine resin, black pepper, bits of thread, and what might be an old button. Clearly you've both been given uniquely tailored blessings, or curses, or options, depending on who you ask and how much wine they've had. In many medieval communities, especially in the countryside where medicine was less science and more educated guessing, these pouches were taken very seriously. The contents were often chosen based on the family's wishes. A mother-in-law hoping for many sons might ask the herb woman to strengthen the bride's womb. A nervous bride might secretly request one that keeps seed from soil. Yes, even in the Middle Ages people had plans. The line between magic and medicine wasn't so much blurred as enthusiastically danced over. The Church officially frowned on these practices, unless of course the results were positive, in which case it tended to look the other way. The irony: many priests were known to secretly consult the same wise women when their sheep stopped birthing lambs or their gardens withered. Fertility was fertility. Now, here's where things get particularly weird. In parts of Scotland and northern England, newlyweds were each given 2 pouches, one filled with draw herbs, meant to encourage conception, and one filled with stay herbs, meant to prevent it. You weren't told which was which. You had to decide, blindly, what kind of future you were hoping for, in this moment, while exhausted, with goat hair still clinging to your ankles. Elsewhere, like in the Iberian Peninsula, the charms were often carved items instead of pouches, tiny wooden idols, usually shaped like animals. A rabbit meant fertility, a snake meant protection, a bird meant luck, a hedgehog? Well, that meant caution. You'd place it under your pillow and wait for dreams to tell you what it meant. One Catalan bride reportedly dreamed of fire, snakes and beans after her charm was gifted. She never married again. Beans were never served in her household. Back in your chamber you stare at the pouch on your lap. Its contents are unsettling, but its presence is even stranger. You're suddenly aware that this marriage, this night, this entire experience hasn't just been about tradition. It's been about control. Not necessarily malicious, but pervasive. Everyone, your family, your spouse's family, the church, the village, that weird old man with the bagpipes, has had a say in what your body is now expected to do. This charm is, in theory, your piece of that power, and yet, you didn't ask for it. Midwives and herbalists were the quiet authorities of fertility. They performed rituals that spanned the gap between medicine and mysticism, measuring a woman's breath, counting the phases of the moon, soaking herbs in wine and leaving them under stones overnight. Some brewed teas from yarrow and mugwort to open the womb. Others created pessaries from beeswax and resin to seal it, depending on what was needed and who was asking. Not all these charms were blessings. Curses were equally common. If a bride had enemies, or jealous suitors, or vengeful neighbours, it wasn't unusual for her to be given a pouch meant to sabotage the union. These would include ashes, nails, sometimes animal bones. The sign. If the pouch felt warm or unusually heavy, something wasn't right. Yours feels warm. Of course, modern scholars argue about the legitimacy of these practices. Some believe they were mostly symbolic, designed to ease anxieties and give people a sense of control in a chaotic world. Others think the knowledge passed down through midwives and healers was far more sophisticated than we give credit for, especially regarding plant-based contraception. There are detailed 13th century herbals that describe wild carrot seed and pennyroyal, both known today to have actual medicinal effects. Still, this charm feels more like a question than an answer. You set it down on the table beside the bed, right next to the relic, which seems to glower disapprovingly. Of course it does. You're not supposed to believe in both church and charm. But you live in a world where belief is layered, tangled, and deeply practical. You've had prayers chanted over your bedsheets and fertility herbs stuffed into your shoes. A priest hid in your wardrobe. A goat watched your first kiss. Someone danced a jig over your future inheritance. If anyone questions your spiritual priorities, they're probably holding a bag of nettles too. There's a knock at the door, soft this time. A servant enters with a basin of warm water, gently sets it down, and nods at the charm without comment. The door closes. You and your spouse sit in silence for a long moment. Then your spouse reaches over, opens their pouch and pulls out a single coin. It's silver, pierced with a hole. Yours has the same. You both laugh. Not out of joy exactly, but something else. Relief, maybe. Recognition. The realization that neither of you knows what tomorrow holds. But at least for now, you're in this strange, sacred mess together. You lie back again, letting the linen pillow cradle your head, breathing in the mingled scents of incense, sweat, rosemary, and possibly rat fur. The charm sits on the table, vibrating with history. The relic glows faintly. The goat snores. Outside the window, the sun is beginning to lower toward the trees, and then someone bangs on the door and yells, "Time for the virginity trial!" You don't even flinch. Of course, the virginity trial. Because what better way to follow up a night of spiritual surveillance, stew-based seduction, and bedpost coin ceremonies than with a public interrogation of your body, and more specifically, what it may or may not have done last night. You don't even react anymore. You just swing your legs over the side of the bed and start pulling on your least offensive robe. Your spouse does the same, moving with the resigned precision of someone who knows the script but never rehearsed the lines. Outside the bedchamber, a crowd is gathering again, less rowdy than the parade crew, but no less invested. Aunts, cousins, godparents, that neighbour who just will not leave. They're all milling about near the hearth with a particular gleam in their eyes reserved for scandal, speculation, or both. In the middle of it all sits a large wooden chair, draped in white linen, and a table set with cups of wine, a plate of apples, and a suspiciously formal-looking scroll. It's giving courtroom, if courtrooms were mostly staffed by in-laws and smelled like roasted goat. The virginity trial, known by many names across Europe, purity inquiry, modesty council, or, in the Czech lands, the rather blunt Nevěstina zkouška, the bride's test, was a ritualized discussion/performance meant to confirm, celebrate, or occasionally challenge the bride's premarital chastity. And yes, sometimes the groom's too, though let's be honest, rarely with the same intensity. You're led to the chair while the crowd arranges itself around the room like a very cheerful inquisition. The matriarch of the household, possibly your new great-aunt, possibly just a very assertive neighbour, steps forward with the scroll and clears her throat dramatically. "We gather," she says, "in the spirit of celebration and scrutiny." The audience claps politely. Your spouse takes a seat, beside you, slightly off-centre as is tradition. This positioning is meaningful. If you sat side by side, you were claiming full mutual confidence. If one sat slightly ahead of the other, it implied innocence for one and suspicion for the other. You both decide to lean back and feign a kind of mutual oblivion. The trial begins with storytelling. Guests are invited, encouraged even, to share what they observed during the bedding rituals, what omens they noticed, what creaks, shouts, or thuds might have indicated a fruitful night. It's absurd, it's deeply invasive, and it's weirdly theatrical. A cousin stands and claims he heard 3 creaks, then silence, then a long sigh. Everyone claps. Someone throws a flower. Then the questions begin. Aunt Matilda, always Aunt Matilda, asks you how your linens fared. Did they stain? Were they folded? Were they inspected? You nod. Vaguely. She presses. By whom? You shrug. She tuts. Another woman, possibly a midwife, possibly just nosy, asks if the relic was warm or cold by morning. Apparently this matters. You can't remember. She writes something in a little notebook anyway. In some regions this phase was actually documented. literally documented. A small official report called the Testamentum Thalami, the bedroom testament, would be drafted by a family scribe and sealed in the family archives. If there were ever disputes about dowry return, annulment, or future inheritance, this report could be called upon. The Middle Ages, where your wedding night was legally notarized. But let's get weirder. In particularly devout or status-obsessed households, the virginity trial involved symbolic reenactments. You heard me. One or both newlyweds might be handed objects: an unbroken egg, a sealed jar, a flower in full bloom, and asked to display what happened the night before. Did the flower wilt? Did the egg break? Did the jar stay sealed? All metaphors, all judged. One groom was reportedly mocked for offering a cracked walnut. His bride, on the other hand, brought forth a pristine lily. He never lived it down. You, fortunately, are handed only a small goblet filled with wine and asked to drink without spilling. You do, barely. Applause. Your spouse is given a grape and told to crush it gently. They nod solemnly and pop it whole into their mouth. Roars of approval, and then comes the final verdict. In some cases it's declared by a parent, in others by the village elder or priest. But here, in this particular house, it's decided by vote. Each guest is handed a small token, usually a seed, coin, or carved button, and told to place it in one of two bowls, pure or questionable. They walk by solemnly, dropping their tokens with exaggerated discretion, as though their vote matters more than the actual wedding night itself. Here's a fringe detail. In some parts of Estonia, instead of tokens, guests would drop phrases into the bowl, written on scraps of cloth: blessings, jokes, insults. The couple wouldn't see them until a year later. It was considered either a gift or a curse, depending on how creative your uncle was with rhyming. The bowls fill, the elder cousin counts. You hold your breath, not because you care about the verdict, but because the stakes are somehow both meaningless and monumental. It's theatre, but it has teeth. Finally, she lifts a hand and proclaims, "Purity affirmed!" The crowd erupts. People cheer. Someone tosses a handful of rice. The goat bleats approvingly from down the hall. You smile. You nod. You quietly plan to burn your bedding. Historians today still debate whether these trials were always serious or more performative. Some argue they were mostly symbolic, a way to reassure families and soothe gossip. Others believe they were brutally real, especially for brides whose worth was tied directly to their perceived untouched status. There are accounts of trials that didn't end in cheers, but in shame, annulments, or worse. But today, here, in this manner of dancing priests and fertility stew, the trial is just another performance, one you've survived. The guests begin to file out, humming celebratory tunes and lightly teasing one another about their votes. You're handed a small satchel of rose petals, a sign of your approved union. Your spouse gets a dried apple core. No explanation. You head back to the chamber, limbs heavy, heart light, utterly done. And just as you close the door, a knock. Again. The aunties are here, with lanterns. They want the sheets. You open the door slowly, and there they are, the aunties. A wall of them, draped in shawls, armed with little brass lanterns, linen-wrapped bundles, and the collective facial expression of women who have waited their whole lives for this moment. You haven't even had time to lie down again, let alone rotate the mattress or erase the evidence of the last 24 hours. Not that it would have helped. They're professionals. One steps forward. Her name is possibly Ludmila, possibly just Auntie, and without a word she lifts her lantern and marches past you. The others follow, like owls in human form. Their shoes are silent. Their eyes scan everything. They're here for the sheets. This is the inspection. In some households it's called the unveiling, in others the proofing, and in certain Slavic regions it has the unfortunate nickname of the red linen judgment. Regardless of what it's called, the tradition is the same: your wedding linens, the very ones upon which you slept, squirmed, or hopefully did much more, are about to be scrutinised under literal candlelight by women who have opinions. Many. Loud ones. The lead auntie reaches the bed and pauses, observing the blanket like a general surveying a battlefield. "It has been used," she says. Not a question. A fact. The others nod in solemn agreement. One draws back the coverlet. Another lifts the corner of the top sheet. A third stoops to check beneath the bed frame, perhaps to look for residual coins, or possibly goat hair. It's all part of the process. You and your spouse are told to sit, back against the far wall, like schoolchildren waiting to be graded. Your only job now is to observe silence, endure the tension, and not faint from embarrassment. The sheets are examined for several key things: wrinkles, warmth, evidence of movement, and of course, blood. Or, in more polite households, the mark. This mark, ideally a small stain on the cloth, was interpreted as physical proof that the bride's virginity had been successfully surrendered. Whether the groom was experienced or not was beside the point. Whether the bride enjoyed herself? Not even on the checklist. The only thing that mattered now was whether the sheet had been properly broken in. One of the aunties pulls out a square of bleached linen from her bundle. It's known as the comparison cloth. It's pristine, folded, and meant to be laid beside your actual sheet as a visual contrast, like a medieval side-by-side. She smooths it over your mattress and gestures for the others to observe. They nod again, murmuring like clerics at a particularly confusing scripture reading. You catch words like adequate, present, faint, and honest. The sheet has passed the vibe check. This ritual was deeply embedded in the fabric of marriage across much of medieval Europe, particularly in eastern regions and among conservative noble houses. It wasn't just symbolic, it was public proof of legitimacy. A family might even keep the cloth as a form of insurance. If there was ever a dispute over annulment, inheritance, or a child's paternity, the sheet could be produced as evidence. In some households, it was even embroidered with the couple's initials and date of union, like a weirdly intimate banner of success. In certain Spanish and Balkan traditions, the cloth would be paraded around the village, yes, paraded, by the bride's female relatives, singing songs of joy, fertility, and occasionally threats to any woman who dared marry without such a mark. It was part triumph, part warning. In Hungary, it was customary to hang the sheet on a clothesline near the well so all could see. A sort of linen-based bulletin board. But of course, biology doesn't always play along. It was widely known, though rarely admitted, that many women did not bleed during their first experience. Some families prepared for this. A discreet midwife might suggest a small scratch of the bride's leg, or even provide a bit of lamb's blood to dab discreetly if things went unremarkably. Other times, a bride would prick her own thumb and dot the linen after the fact. Everyone looked the other way, sometimes literally. A fringe case from a rural village in southern France describes a bride who embroidered a tiny red rose in the corner of the sheet before the wedding, claiming it would invite good luck. The morning after, the sheet passed inspection without question. 50 years later, her great-granddaughter would repeat the trick and earn the same applause. Still, not all inspections went well. There are records, often hushed, sometimes public, of sheets deemed inconclusive. In such cases, the bride's family might be summoned, the groom might be interrogated, rumours might fly, dowries could be challenged. In rare and deeply unfair cases, the bride might be subjected to a second inspection, or worse, sent back to a family unconfirmed. The social stain from this could last a lifetime. Back in your chamber, though, things seem to be going oddly fine. One auntie folds the sheet neatly and places it into a basket lined with straw. Another pours a bit of lavender water over the mattress and murmurs a brief blessing. May this bed be soft to love and hard to lies. A third hands you a small posy of marjoram and rue, herbs for calm and fertility respectively. The posy is wet. You don't ask why. You're still processing this entire experience when the lead auntie turns to you and says, "Would you like the sheet back, or shall we keep it for the family archive?" You blink. Your spouse says, "Oh, keep it, please." Everyone nods. The women gather their things. The lanterns flicker. There's a brief moment of warmth, even affection, in their farewells. Whatever the ritual's roots, control, tradition, superstition, it has become something else in their hands. A passing down, a protective act. Weird, deeply invasive, but somehow comforting. The way only old women with sharp elbows and sharper instincts can be. They leave. You and your spouse stare at the now bare mattress, the air still thick with rosewater, smoke, and a hint of goat. You flop back onto the mattress, and then someone knocks on the door. Again. This time, it's the groomsmen. They've got wine, and a list of tasks for the groom. The groomsmen enter like a conquering army of fools, loud, ruddy-faced, and carrying more pitchers of wine than any sane household should have stored indoors. They burst into the room without knocking again, because privacy is now a quaint notion, long since trampled beneath stew ladles, fertility chants, and the steady thrum of ceremonial nonsense. At this point, you've stopped even flinching when a door slams open. You just sigh and brace. The man at the front, probably your spouse's oldest friend, maybe also their worst influence, raises a cup and shouts, "Time for the trials of the groom!" Your spouse groans quietly and mutters, "Of course it is." This next event, carried out with varying degrees of seriousness across medieval Europe, is sometimes called the virility gauntlet, the husband's rights, or, if we're being honest, the test of whether the groom can drink, lift and joke his way into the respect of other men. It's half hazing, half on a ceremony, and entirely designed to prove that the groom is not only married but manly, which in medieval terms translates to strong, fertile, brave, slightly ridiculous, and able to survive humiliation with a smile. The groomsmen form a circle around your spouse, who is promptly handed a drinking horn the size of a loaf of bread. It's full, of course, sweet wine spiced with something that smells faintly like mustard and regret. The first task, finish it, in one go. Bonus points for not spilling or choking. Everyone watches in complete silence. You can practically hear the wine sloshing. Your spouse lifts the horn, tilts their head back, and gulps. Halfway through, someone starts chanting, "Drink! Drink! Don't be weak," because even 14th century rituals can't resist peer pressure. When it's done, and to their credit, your spouse doesn't cough even once, they're handed a second cup and told to toast their bride. That's you. They turn, lock eyes with you, and say something surprisingly sweet and only mildly slurred. The crowd cheers. Someone weeps into their moustache. You're not sure if it's from the sentiment or the wine, but that's just the warm-up. Next comes the series of tasks, each one drawn from a long-standing list of so-called proofs. These vary from region to region, but most include some variation of the following: lifting a heavy object, demonstrating weapon skills, completing physical challenge, and answering embarrassing questions with wit. The goal isn't just to entertain, it's to show the groom is healthy, quick-thinking, and socially agile enough to survive marriage, fatherhood, and most importantly, group dinners. The object they bring out for lifting is a barrel. Empty, thank the saints, but still large enough to make a statement. Your spouse heaves it up, staggers only slightly, and sets it back down to raucous applause. The next challenge? Balance an egg on a sword hilt. Blindfolded, while reciting a bawdy verse, they manage it for 6 seconds before the egg slides off and smacks a cousin in the boot. More cheering. The cousin doesn't even look up. A long wooden spoon is brought forth. This, apparently, is for the next trial, stirring the pot of future troubles. Your spouse is blindfolded again, because what's a medieval wedding without repeated disorientation, and asked to stir a large pot while being pelted with increasingly weird questions. How many children will you have? What if they're all twins? What's your plan if your wife grows a beard? They answer without hesitation, and their responses are just cheeky enough to win favour without sounding like a tavern joke. Another task passed. Then comes the fire test. No, not actual fire. This isn't a witch trial, it's a ritualised test of warmth. Your spouse is handed a chunk of firewood and asked to build a flame in the hearth, quickly, steadily, and without help. The idea here is that a good husband can maintain the household fire, both literal and symbolic. The kind of man who keeps warmth in the home and doesn't burn it down. Your spouse does well enough. The flame flares to life. Someone throws a pinch of herbs on it, and the room smells briefly of thyme and roasted apple. But here comes the fringe twist. In some parts of medieval Italy, the final trial was a riddle posed by an elder. Often dirty, sometimes philosophical, always strange. The groom had to answer it correctly or risk a mock penalty. These penalties range from being tied to a goat for a day to wearing a woman's apron at the next feast. In one infamous account from Milan, the groom guessed incorrectly and had to milk a cow in front of the town council. He became a folk hero. Your spouse is handed a scroll and told to read aloud. You must build a house with no doors, fill it with air, and give it away without losing it. What is it? They pause. You watch. The groomsmen lean in. A song, your spouse says. The room goes quiet, then someone bellows, "Brilliant!" and everyone erupts in celebration. Someone pours wine down their own shirt. Someone else begins a slow clap. Even the cousin with egg on his boot is applauding. At the height of the joy, a crown of vine leaves is placed on your spouse's head. It's the garland of virility, meant to signify they've passed the trials and earned the right to be called not just husband, but man of the house. This title will last exactly until the next feast, when the old men challenge him to arm wrestling and mock his grip. Tradition is relentless. The ritual closes with a final toast. One of the groomsmen lifts a cup and declares, "To love without chains, to homes with laughter, and to beds that don't squeak too loud." Everyone drinks. Some spill. No one cares. Eventually they stagger out, leaving behind the smell of spiced wine, sweat, and charred kindling. Your spouse collapses next to you on the mattress, breathless but triumphant. You turn your head to say something, anything, and just as you open your mouth, the door creaks. A small, quiet girl enters. She's holding a loaf of bread. It's time for the sharing of the crumbs. The girl stands in the doorway, silent as dusk, clutching a round loaf of bread the size of her head. It's wrapped in a linen cloth that's been carefully embroidered with red thread, spirals, vines, and what might be a very optimistic depiction of two doves kissing. She looks at you, at your spouse, then slowly steps forward and places the bread on the table beside your rumpled bed. Then she curtsies, just a whisper of emotion, and slips out without a word. You look at the loaf. The loaf looks back. This is the bread of binding, and yes, of course, it has a ritual attached to it. Everything in your life does now. You and your spouse sit up again, feet dangling off the edge of the mattress like exhausted pilgrims at the last inn on earth. The room still carries the scents of vine leaves, goat fur, incense, and wine-stained groomsmen. Now it will also smell like warm rye and whatever lesson this ritual has in store. The bread is a tradition most commonly seen in the northern and central parts of Europe. Places where wheat was sacred, ovens were central to village life, and symbolism could be baked directly into your breakfast. In some regions it was called marriage bread, in others witness loaf, and in some particularly poetic circles, the crust of covenant. Its purpose? To be broken, shared and eaten, quietly, solemnly, and with deep awareness of what has just happened. Your lives have officially fused, like dough under heat. You reach for the cloth and unwrap the loaf. The crust is golden, cracked, dusted with flour. A faint smell of caraway wafts up. Tucked beneath the bread is a small wooden knife. Of course it's wooden. Metal would be too sharp for such a tender moment. The knife is engraved with symbols, a heart, a sheaf of grain, a sleeping moon. The first step is slicing the bread exactly down the middle. One half for you, one half for your spouse. You do the honours. The crust gives way with a soft crunch. Inside, the bread is airy and warm, flecked with herbs. You each take your piece. The remaining crumbs, the ones scattered on the table in your palms on the cloth, those are the real point of the ceremony, because now it's time to share them. The sharing of the crumbs is a quiet ritual, one of the few in this whole chaotic wedding circus that doesn't involve shouting, chanting, or surprise goat appearances. It's intimate, strange, and oddly moving. You and your spouse are to take turns giving crumbs to one another. Not mouthfuls, not bites, just crumbs, one at a time, pressed into the other's palm or lips. Each crumb represents something you'll need to survive your married life. Patience, humour, tenderness, strength, forgiveness. And each one must be offered with a word or promise. You go first. You pinch a crumb from your piece and place it gently in your spouse's hand. Rest, you say. They smile faintly and return the gesture. Light, they whisper, and so it goes. Kindness, bravery, mercy, wine. You both laugh at that one. Some crumbs are given in silence, some accompanied by a wink, a tear, a twitch of the shoulder that says I'm not good at words, but here's a piece of bread instead. You lose track of how many you've passed back and forth. Eventually you've eaten your halves down to crusts, and the tablecloth is a mess of scattered white and gold flakes. And then you each gather the remaining crumbs, carefully, reverently, and pour them into a small clay dish set beside the bread. This dish, you're told, will be dried, sealed with wax, and kept under the bed. If you ever fall into discord, the elder says, you must open it, crush the dried crumbs together, mix them with honey and water, and drink the paste. It's symbolic, of course, but also terrible. Most couples would rather resolve their argument than choke down fermented breadcrumb sludge. This isn't just about food, it's a form of binding. In societies where written contracts were rare and most marriages weren't fully understood by the people involved, rituals like this gave shape to promises. A broken oath might be forgotten, a chewed crust shared beneath candlelight. That stays with you. Here's a fringe fact. In a few German villages, couples would secretly mark their bread pieces with tiny symbols, scratched with a pin before baking. A leaf meant protect me. A circle meant complete me. A star meant forgive what I don't say aloud. Some loaves were so densely marked, they look like baked manuscripts. Archaeologists have found preserved bread crusts from the 14th century etched with runes, love notes of a kind. Back in your chamber, the dish of crumbs now sits capped with a beeswax seal. The elder, who somehow materialised in the doorway right as you finished, like all the best ghosts, nods approvingly, takes the knife and cloth, and leaves without a word. The silence that follows is thick but soft, like a down blanket pulled over your ears. You lie back again, this time fully clothed, fully fed, and almost fully at peace. There is no music, no wine being splashed on the floor, no bed dancing, no inspections or chants or riddles, just the last golden light of day slipping through the window, lighting up the soft edges of the room. A goat snores somewhere in the hallway. The relic glows faintly from its niche in the wall. You've made it through everything, almost, until the door creaks open again, slowly, hesitantly. It's a child, another one, holding a pair of wooden shoes, and you already know. It's time for the first step together ceremony. The child doesn't speak, just shuffles forward on tiny bare feet and holds out the wooden shoes like they're relics of some ancient god, which, in a way, they are. Because these shoes, these clunky, splintery little clogs, are not merely footwear. They're the official tools of your final ritual as newlyweds, the first step together ceremony, or as it's sometimes called in the Low Countries, die erste Stap, or in certain Germanic regions, Eheläutenschritt, which sounds like something you'd say after tripping on a root and dropping a cow. The child places the shoes side by side on the floor, one in front of the other, facing the hearth. Then, with a solemnity far beyond their years, they nod, turn, and walk out of the room. You and your spouse look at each other, then at the shoes, then back at each other. Of course. One more tradition. The first step. Together is deceptively simple. You both step into the same pair of shoes, your right foot, their left, and walk in sync across the room. From your marriage bed to the hearth, from the place where love is made to the place where life is sustained. It's symbolic of unity, of mutual burden, and of the reality that marriage, medieval or otherwise, means always walking in someone else's rhythm. You inch closer. The shoes are, unsurprisingly, not the right size for either of you. They're big enough to accommodate 2 feet, but not comfortably. When you each slip a foot in, yours on the right, your spouse's on the left, it's immediately awkward. You're both leaning slightly in, shoulders touching, arms linked. You take a deep breath. Someone coughs in the hallway. You realise with a sigh that you have an audience again. In many medieval communities, this ritual was observed by a quiet crowd of family members, never loud, never interfering. It was meant to be watched in silence so that the couple could hear their own breath, the creak of wood, the scrape of soul against stone. These were the sounds of their new life beginning. This was your first act of teamwork. You shuffle forward. The shoes creak. You sway. One of you steps slightly ahead. You adjust. The floor is uneven, and the scent of ash and herbs rises from the hearth as you near it. You try to walk in unison, but your spouse stumbles slightly and you both laugh. A short, breathless chuckle that breaks the sacred silence. A child giggles from behind the curtain. Someone clears their throat with performative disapproval. Still, you keep going. The goal is to reach the hearth together without stepping out of the shoes. If you do, it means you're destined to share burdens evenly, walk as equals, and weather life's uneven ground with grace. If one foot slips out, well, it's not the end of the world, but you'll hear about it, repeatedly, possibly for the rest of your life. Here's a fringe version of the ritual. In some alpine villages, couples were required to walk not across a room, but across an entire courtyard in a pair of lashed-together boots, in mud, uphill, during spring thaw. It was less a marriage ritual and more an audition for competitive barn hauling. A legend from one Swiss town tells of a couple who reached the finish line without falling and were given a whole pig as a prize. They named it Honeymoon. It bit everyone. You make it to the hearth. Barely. As you reach the final step, your spouse stumbles again, but you catch them. You both laugh, this time less nervously. There's a moment of stillness. The fire crackles. Someone in the hall exhales. Then the shoes are gently removed by yet another child, who bows and vanishes into the corridor like a dream courier. Now comes the final part, the binding of the coals. A small clay bowl is placed in the hearth, and from the central flame, one glowing coal is taken and set inside it. This coal represents the first shared ember of your new home. You'll keep it burning, literally or metaphorically, as the foundation of your shared life. In theory, it should stay warm until the birth of your first child. In reality, it'll probably get used to light a stew fire next week. But the point stands. You both kneel before the hearth, hands held over the warmth. A hush settles over the house. It's almost reverent. There are no jokes, no flutes, no goat braying somewhere inappropriately. Just you, your spouse, the coal, and the slow acceptance that you've crossed the line between ritual and reality. And here's the kicker. After all of this, after the processions and the coins and the stew and the priest in the wardrobe, this moment feels real. Not just symbolic, real. Maybe it's the exhaustion. Maybe it's the simple act of kneeling in front of a fire with someone whose rhythm you've started to match. Maybe it's just the shoes. You sit for a while, letting the warmth seep into your fingers. Later, you'll be expected to place the coal bowl under your bed or on the windowsill, depending on which local superstition you've decided to follow. In some households, it's wrapped in wool, In others, kissed every morning. One chronicled wedding in Bohemia involved the couple naming the coal and writing lullabies for it. They never had children, but their garden was extraordinary. There's a final knock on the door, but this time it's gentle, respectful. When it opens, there's no ritual, no task, just an elder holding a blanket. "It's done," she says with a smile that carries 1,000 traditions. "You can rest now." You take the blanket. You wrap it around both of you, and for the first time in days the door stays shut.